Chapter 1. The Long Road East. 2 weeks. It had been nearly 2 weeks since they had left the shores of Patch behind. 2 weeks since Ruby had quietly slipped away in the early morning darkness. 2 weeks since Team Juniper had departed for Mistral. And 2 weeks since Belgariad, Garyon, Silk and Crow had agreed to accompany them eastward across the vast continent of Anima. The journey had been long stretches of road wound through forests, rolling hills and forgotten valleys. Some nights they slept beneath the stars, while Wren gathered food and Nora complained about the lack of pancakes. Other nights they found small inns where warm beds and hot meals felt like treasures. The world felt different now, quieter. Not because the danger had passed, quite the opposite. The fall of Beacon hung over every village they passed like a dark cloud. News traveled slowly without the CCT network, but it still traveled. People spoke of Beacon's destruction, of grim attacks, of uncertainty, and of fear. And wherever fear lingered, Grim were never far behind. The travelers had settled into a rhythm. Ruby often walked near the front of the group with crescent rose slung across her back. Though she still smiled and tried to keep everyone's spirits up, there was a new determination behind her eyes. She had seen too much to remain the carefree girl who had first entered Beacon. John had changed as well. Leadership now rested upon his shoulders, not because anyone had appointed him, because circumstances had demanded it. Beside him walked Pyrrha, the invincible girl, or at least she had once been. The title felt strange now. Foreign Pyrrha had died. Not truly, but she had felt death. She remembered the arrow, the pain, the darkness. And even now, weeks later, the memory lingered. Every battle felt different. Every swing of her spear carried hesitation she had never known before. John noticed, but he never pushed, never forced. He simply remained there, a quiet presence and a steady hand whenever she needed one. And for now, that was enough. At the rear of the group, Silk rode comfortably atop a borrowed horse, while Belgariad walked beside him. "You're doing it again," Silk said. Belgariad glanced upward. Doing what? Staring at everyone, as though they're pieces on a game board. The old sorcerer snorted. "They are pieces on a game board. That's exactly what I mean." Ahead of them, Garyon laughed. Some things never changed. Even the end of worlds apparently couldn't alter Belgariad's habit of manipulating everyone around him. Crow groaned. "I liked him better when I thought he was just a grumpy old man." Belgariad looked offended. "I am a grumpy old man." "No," Silk replied. "You're considerably worse." 3 days later they arrived at a small village, nestled near the edge of an immense forest. The village elder greeted them with obvious relief. "You must help us." The desperation in his voice immediately caught everyone's attention. Ruby stepped forward. "What's wrong?" The elderly man swallowed nervously. "A Geist Grim. Every huntsman present stiffened. We've lost livestock. Buildings have been damaged, and 2 men were injured trying to drive it away." Crow frowned. "A Geist, this far from civilization?" The elder nodded. "It lives in the forest." Belgariad's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain," the villagers quickly described the creature. "A Geist. One of the stranger, grim, a spirit-like entity, capable of possessing objects and constructing bodies from whatever materials surrounded it. Stone, wood, metal, anything." Ruby looked toward Jean and he nodded. "We'll handle it." The forest was unnaturally quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to remain there. The group moved carefully beneath towering trees while Wren searched for signs. Then he found them. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and eventually a clearing. The Grim was waiting. Black smoke swirled around a twisted skeletal core, hovering several feet above the ground. Around it towered a massive body constructed from trees, stone, roots and boulders ripped directly from the forest floor. The monster stood nearly 20 feet tall. Nora grinned. "Finally!" The Geist roared. The battle began instantly. Roots exploded from the earth. Ruby launched forward. Crescent Rose transformed with a metallic snap as she accelerated into a whirlwind of red petals. John raised Crocea Moors. Pyrrha's shield locked into position, Ren vanished into motion, and Nora laughed like someone greeting an old friend. The Geist fought viciously. Every damaged limb was replaced almost immediately as nearby debris tore free and reformed into new arms and weapons. A stone fist crashed into the ground where Ruby had stood moments earlier. The impact shook the clearing. "Little busy," Ruby shouted. "No kidding," Jean yelled back. The Geist adapted constantly. Trees became spears, roots became whips, and boulders became fists. For nearly 10 minutes, neither side gained an advantage. Then Pyrrha saw at the core, the true grim body hidden within the construct. Normally she would have acted instantly. Normally she wouldn't have hesitated, but Beacon lingered in her mind, the memory of failure, of death. For one terrible moment she froze. The opening vanished, and the Geist struck. A massive branch slammed into her shield and sent her crashing backward. "Pyrrha!" Jean rushed forward immediately. The concern in his voice snapped her from her thoughts. Pyrrha blinked, embarrassment flooded through her. "I'm fine." The words felt hollow. Jean knew it. She knew it. But neither said anything. Instead, Jean offered a hand. After a brief hesitation, Pyrrha accepted it. Then together they rejoined the battle. This time, when the opening appeared, Pyrrha acted. Using her semblance, her spear flew as she guided it through a narrow gap in the creature's defenses. The weapon struck the Geist's core directly. The Grim shrieked. Ruby immediately seized the opportunity. "Now!" Crescent Rose fired. Ren attacked from the left, and Nora struck from above. Jean and Pyrrha charged together. The Geist's body collapsed, its black core shattered, and the Grim dissolved into smoke. Silence returned to the clearing. For several moments nobody moved. Then Nora raised Magnild triumphantly. "We won!" Back at the village, celebrations began immediately. The villagers thanked the huntsman repeatedly. Food appeared, and children followed Ruby everywhere. The elder eventually approached the group with tears in his eyes. "You have saved us," Ruby smiled. "It's what huntsmen do." As the festivities continued, Belgariad stood apart from the crowd alongside Garion and Silk. The old sorcerer watched quietly. Garion glanced toward him. "You knew they could handle it." "Of course. Then why didn't we help?" Belgariad folded his arms. "Because they needed to." Garion frowned. The old man gestured toward Pyrrha. "Especially her." Garion followed his gaze. Pyrrha stood with the others, smiling, laughing, but not entirely convincing. Belgariad sighed softly. "She survived death." Garion nodded. "I know. Many warriors don't recover quickly from that," Belgariad said sagely. For a moment neither spoke, then Silk broke the silence. "At least she's still standing." Belgariad nodded. "Yes." His eyes lingered on the young huntress. "Which means there is hope." As evening settled over the village and the road to Mistral stretched endlessly eastward before them, none of them realized that far greater trials awaited. The Battle of Beacon had changed them, but the journey ahead would test them, and before it was over, every one of them would be forced to confront who they truly were. Chapter 2. A Weapon for a Drasnian. The celebration in the village lasted well into the evening. Lanterns hung from wooden posts throughout the settlement, casting warm pools of light across the central square. Villagers who only hours before had feared leaving their homes now laughed, sang and shared food with their rescuers. The destruction wrought by the Geist Grim had been considerable, but it was gone now. For the first time in weeks, the people could breathe easy. Ruby sat atop a wagon wheel devouring her second helping of stew, while Nora was somehow on her fourth plate and showing no signs of slowing down. "Where does it all go?" Jean asked in amazement. Nora shrugged. "Trade secret." Ren quietly sipped his tea. "I've learned not to ask." Laughter spread around the table, and even Pyrrha smiled. The smile was smaller than it once would have been, but it was genuine. Garion noticed. So did Belgariad. Neither said anything. The village elder eventually approached the group carrying a lantern. "My friends," he said warmly, "there is someone who wishes to speak with you." The huntsmen and travelers followed him through the village toward a large stone workshop near the edge of town. The sound of hammering echoed from within. When they entered, heat immediately washed over them. A forge burned brightly in the center of the room. Standing beside it was a broad-shouldered Faunus with dark brown hair and curved ram horns protruding from either side of his head. His arms were thick with muscle, and years of smithing had left them covered in old burns and scars. The elder smiled. "This is Master Torren." The blacksmith nodded respectfully. "I heard what you did for our village." Ruby rubbed the back of her neck. "We were happy to help. Then allow me to repay the favor." His gaze swept across the group. "I can repair, improve, or modify any weapon or armor you possess." Nora's eyes lit up. "Really?" The blacksmith chuckled. "Really?" Within moments, everyone was presenting equipment for inspection. Crozier Moors received a careful examination and suggestions on integrating the shield and sword for special situations. Maghild was checked for structural wear. Stormflower underwent maintenance, and even Pyrrha reluctantly allowed Master Torren to inspect Milo and Akuo. Meanwhile, Silk stood quietly near the back of the workshop with his arms crossed. Ruby noticed immediately. "What about you?" Silk blinked. "What about me, Weapon?" she insisted. "I have weapons," Silk replied with a smirk. Ruby glanced at the assortment of hidden knives strapped throughout his clothing. Those were not what she meant. "I mean a real weapon." Silk looked offended. "They are real." Garion laughed. The Drasnian shot him a glare, and Belgarath smirked. Ruby, however, was already thinking a dangerous sign. Garion had learned during the past 2 weeks that when Ruby became excited about something, stopping her was nearly impossible. The young huntress suddenly leapt to her feet. "I've got it!" Everyone immediately looked concerned. Even Torren paused from his work. "What?" Jean asked cautiously. Ruby pointed dramatically at Silk. "We build him a remnant weapon." Silence. Silk blinked. "A what?" "A remnant weapon." Ruby grinned. "Something awesome." Nora slammed her hands onto the table. "Yes." Ren sighed. "We should probably hear her out." Several hours later, sketches littered an enormous workbench. Ruby had become completely absorbed in the project. Torren stood beside her, while Silk occupied a chair looking increasingly worried. "This was a mistake," he muttered. "No, it wasn't," Ruby replied without looking up. "It absolutely was," Silk countered. Garion leaned over the table. "What exactly are these things supposed to do?" Ruby pointed at one of the sketches. "Okay, so Silk relies on speed, naturally. He likes hidden weapons. Obviously, he likes surprises." Silk grinned. "Now you're speaking my language." Ruby tapped the drawing. "So we build 2 wrist-mounted weapons." The others leaned in closer. The design resembled a pair of reinforced bracers, and along the top sat a complex launching mechanism. Below it rested a second chamber. Torren studied the drawing. "Interesting." Ruby nodded eagerly. "The top assembly fires blades, knives?" Silk asked. "Single knives." She pointed to another section. "Or multiple knives." Silk's eyes widened. "Multiple?" Nora looked impressed. "That's sneaky." "I know," Torren continued studying the plans. "And the lower chamber?" Ruby smiled. "Cartridges." Silk frowned. "Dust?" "No." Ruby shook her head. "You won't have dust back home." The room quieted slightly. That was something they occasionally forgot, that someday, if they found a way, Belgarath, Garion, and Silk would return to their own world. And any weapon dependent upon Remnant's resources would eventually become useless. Garion nodded approvingly. "Smart." Ruby pointed toward a series of notes. "Instead, explosive powder." Torren's eyebrows rose. "Black powder. Basically," the smith smiled. "That could work. The cartridges would not possess the versatility of dust rounds. They would, however, function anywhere in Remnant. In Garion's world, or anywhere else." Silk slowly leaned forward. Now he was interested. The following day became a blur of construction, and Torren proved every bit the master craftsman the villagers claimed. Steel was heated, components were forged, springs and mechanisms assembled. Ruby spent nearly the entire day assisting. Garion occasionally helped, mostly by carrying heavy materials. Belgarath observed from a nearby chair while pretending not to be interested. Silk spent much of the day offering criticism. Too bulky. Too obvious. Can we hide that? Can we make it quieter? Torren eventually threatened to throw him into the forge. The threat noticeably improved Silk's attitude. By late afternoon, the weapons were complete. The twin braces fit comfortably beneath Silk's sleeves. A slight movement of his wrists could deploy blades from concealed housings. A second mechanism allowed him to fire small projectiles loaded with black powder cartridges. RWBY looked immensely proud. Try them. Silk examined the weapons. Then they went outside and he activated one. A blade shot forward with startling speed and buried itself in a wooden target. Several villagers jumped. Silk stared, then grinned. "Oh, I like these." RWBY pumped her fist triumphantly. "Yes," Garion laughed. "You've created a monster." "Probably." Belgarath sighed. "Definitely." The group remained one additional night in the village. The next morning they prepared to depart with several villagers gathered to see them off. Master Torren shook hands with each traveler before finally turning to Silk. "Use them well." Silk flexed his wrists. "I intend to." The blacksmith smiled. "I have no doubt with supplies packed and farewells exchanged, the travelers once again took to the road. The forests of Anima stretched endlessly before them. For most of the day, their journey remained peaceful until shortly before sunset, where the sun had slipped lower toward the horizon as the travelers followed the winding road east. A lone figure appeared in the distance. As he drew closer, RWBY suddenly smiled. "Crow." The huntsman lifted a hand in greeting. "Hey, kiddo." He looked tired. Dust coated his boots and coat, and there were fresh scratches along one sleeve that suggested he had encountered trouble during his travels. Belgarath immediately noticed. "You found something?" Crow's expression darkened. The group gradually gathered around him. For several moments he remained silent, then he removed a folded map from inside his coat and tossed it onto a nearby log. "Something's wrong out there." RWBY's smile faded. "Grim!" Crow shook his head. "Not just grim." He pointed toward several marked locations. 3 abandoned villages. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Abandoned?" Jean asked. Crow nodded. "Completely." His finger moved to another area. 2 more barely hanging on. Ren frowned. "What happened?" "The same thing that's happening all over Eastern Anima outside the kingdoms." Crow folded his arms. "First come the raids. Bandits?" Pyrrha asked. "Probably." His tone suggested uncertainty. "Then people get scared." He tapped the map. "Then the Grim show up." Belgarath's eyes narrowed. "A cycle." "Yeah." Crow looked toward the darkening horizon. "And it's spreading." The cheerful mood from earlier slowly evaporated. The road ahead suddenly felt much longer, much darker. Finally, RWBY broke the silence. "Then I guess it's a good thing we're heading that way." Crow managed a faint smile. "That's one way of looking at it." The sun disappeared beyond the horizon, and night settled over the road. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the forests and mountains of Anima, trouble was already waiting. Chapter 3. Echoes of Two Worlds. The campfire crackled softly beneath the stars. Night had settled across the forests of Anima, and the sounds of insects and distant wildlife drifted through the darkness beyond the circle of light. The travelers had made camp several miles from the village where they had helped destroy the Geist Grim. Most of the group sat around the fire, finishing the last of their evening meal. Nora was enthusiastically recounting her favorite moments from the battle. "And then it hit the tree and exploded, and I hit it again." Ren calmly sipped his tea. "You hit it several times before that." "Exactly." RWBY laughed. Jean simply shook his head. Across the fire, Belgarath sat smoking his pipe, while Crow leaned against a nearby log. The older huntsman had spent the better part of an hour describing the worsening situation throughout Eastern Anima. The mood had become noticeably more somber. Eventually, Crow stood. "All right." Everyone looked toward him. "We're far enough from the village that we shouldn't attract anything immediately, but I'd rather not take chances. He adjusted Harbinger across his back. We'll keep a rotating watch. Ruby nodded. Sounds good. Crow glanced toward the darkness beyond the firelight. I'm going to take a look around first and make sure there aren't any surprises waiting for us. He had only taken a few steps when Belgariad suddenly spoke. Curious, Crow stopped. Everyone else looked toward the old sorcerer. What is? Crow asked. Belgariad studied him carefully. I never noticed it before. Noticed what? Ruby asked. The old man scratched his beard thoughtfully. Magic. The word immediately drew everyone's attention. Crow became very still. Belgariad continued. A rather unusual enchantment. Silence settled over the campsite. Belgariad narrowed his eyes. Unique, Crow sighed. Belgariad, well crafted. The old sorcerer ignored him. And definitely not from my world. Ruby blinked. What kind of enchantment? Belgariad's gaze remained fixed on Crow. If I'm interpreting it correctly, a small smile appeared beneath his beard. It allows him to assume another form. The entire campsite froze. Every head slowly turned toward Crow. The huntsman closed his eyes. For several long moments, nobody spoke. Finally, he groaned. Oh, Oz, I really hate it when you're right. Ruby's eyes widened. Wait. She pointed dramatically. No way. Crow rubbed his face. No. Ruby stood. Yes. No. Yes. Nora jumped to her feet. What is happening? John looked thoroughly confused. Pyrrha appeared fascinated. Wren simply raised an eyebrow. Silk smirked. Crow looked around the circle and immediately realized he wasn't escaping this. With another sigh, he folded his arms. Years ago, Ozpin gave me a gift. Belgariad quietly murmured, an enchantment. Yeah. Crow nodded. That too. Ruby was practically vibrating, and Crow pointed at her. You're not helping? Sorry. She absolutely wasn't sorry. Crow rolled his eyes. It lets me turn into a bird. Silence. Then, Ruby. No way. Nora. That's awesome. Pyrrha. Remarkable. Jean simply stared. Wren looked thoughtful. Silk chuckled. Crow pinched the bridge of his nose. I knew this was a mistake. Ruby immediately pointed. Show us. No. Please. No, please. Crow glared. Ruby smiled. He gave up. With a flash, the huntsman vanished. A black crow appeared where he had stood. The reactions were immediate. Nora nearly screamed. Jean nearly fell off his log. Pyrrha covered her mouth in surprise. Ruby looked as though she had just witnessed the greatest thing in her life. The crow hopped once, then transformed back into Crow. There, he crossed his arms. Happy? No. Ruby grinned. Do it again. Absolutely not. The camp erupted into laughter. Across the fire, Belgariad slowly rose to his feet. Garyon immediately recognized his look. I think I'll accompany Crow, Belgariad said. The others looked toward him. What do you mean? Jean asked. The old sorcerer smiled, then changed. Silver light shimmered around him. His body blurred. Clothing vanished. Within moments, a large wolf stood where the old man had been. Its coat was silver-gray, frosted almost white around the muzzle and shoulders. The wolf regarded the stunned group calmly, then sat down. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Finally, Nora pointed. That is a wolf. The wolf blinked. Ruby looked ready to explode. Pyrrha stared in astonishment. Jean opened and closed his mouth several times. Wren looked impressed. Garyon laughed. Meanwhile, Silk simply leaned back against his log. The expressions around the campfire suggested nobody believed that was possible. The wolf rose. Crow shook his head. You people are weird. The wolf's tail flicked once. Then both scouts disappeared into the darkness beyond the camp. The moment they vanished, every eye turned toward Garyon. The young king immediately recognized what was coming. Oh boy, Ruby pointed. Explain everything, Nora added. Garyon laughed. Where do I even start? How does he do that? Pyrrha asked. Magic, Garyon replied. Ruby folded her arms. That's not an explanation. Fair. He considered for a moment. In our world, we use something called the will and the word. The group listened carefully. It isn't aura. He looked toward Jean. It isn't a semblance. Then toward RWBY. And it isn't dust. So what is it? Ren asked. Garion stared into the fire. The simplest explanation is that a sorcerer imposes their will directly upon the world. The silence that followed lasted several moments. Nora blinked. That sounds terrifying. Garion laughed. It can be. He thought about all the mistakes he had made while learning, then all the disasters Belgariad had spent centuries preventing. Most sorcerers spend years learning restraint. A memory surfaced, Belgariad explaining why power without discipline could destroy kingdoms, about how a sorcerer can create, but not obliterate something as if it never existed. Garion smiled slightly. My grandfather spent thousands of years learning. The reactions around the fire immediately changed. They had already known Belgariad was old, but hearing it stated so casually still felt strange. Eventually the conversation drifted elsewhere. The fire burned lower. One by one the travelers settled into their bedrolls, and beneath the stars of an unfamiliar world, sleep gradually claimed them. Morning arrived with birdsong. RWBY awoke to the smell of coffee, and as she sat up and rubbed her eyes, the camp was already stirring. Ren was preparing breakfast. Nora was awake and somehow already hungry. John was checking equipment, and Pyrrha sat quietly near the fire. And beside the glowing embers sat Crow and Belgariad. The old sorcerer was once again in human form. A pipe rested in his hand. Crow nursed a steaming cup of coffee. RWBY blinked. "You're back already?" Crow glanced over. "Been back for about an hour." Belgariad nodded. "Nothing immediate." The old man's eyes drifted toward the eastern horizon. Though the region grows increasingly unstable, the comment lingered in everyone's thoughts as camp was broken, and the journey resumed. Several hours later, smoke appeared ahead. At first it was only a thin column rising above distant trees, then another, and another. The mood immediately darkened. Crow's expression hardened. Belgariad quietly removed his pipe. Nobody needed to say anything. They all knew something was wrong. RWBY and Jean were the first to run ahead. The others followed close behind. As they emerged from the forest, they found the remains of a village. Buildings had been burned. Several still smoldered. Abandoned carts littered the streets. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. RWBY's stomach tightened. Xion, Crow muttered. The name sounded familiar. Then she remembered the map. One of the villages Crow had marked. Movement caught her eye. Near the center of the village sat an injured huntsman. His back rested against a collapsed wall. A large wound stretched across his abdomen. Blood soaked his clothing. Jean reached him first. Oh no. The huntsman looked up weakly. "Your huntsman?" "Yeah." Jean immediately knelt. "What happened?" The man's expression darkened bandits. He coughed, then grim, the cycle exactly as Crow had described. Jean didn't waste another second. He placed his hands against the injured man's shoulder, and golden light appeared. The others arrived moments later as Jean's aura flowed into the wounded huntsman. The injury slowly began to close, and the man's breathing steadied. Color gradually returned to his face. Garion watched with interest. Even after weeks of traveling together, aura remained fascinating. When the healing was complete, the huntsman looked visibly stronger, exhausted, but alive. He stared at Jean in disbelief. "Thank you," Jean smiled. "You're welcome." They remained in Xion only long enough to help the survivors gather supplies and organize the evacuation. The village itself was beyond saving. As evening approached, the group moved several miles away before making camp in a quiet forest glade. No one wanted to sleep among the ruins. The fire burned softly. Conversation remained subdued. The destruction of Xion weighed heavily on everyone. Eventually, RWBY glanced toward Garion. "Can I ask you something?" The young king looked up.
"Sure." RWBY hesitated, then smiled. "Did you have a team?" Garion blinked. "A team? Like us. Ruby gestured around the fire.
People you traveled with. Garion's expression softened. For a moment he was silent. Then he smiled. Oh, the memories came flooding back. Yeah, but I wouldn't exactly call them a team, but more like companions, Garion told her. Chapter 4, Echoes of the Fallen. Garion stared thoughtfully into the fire for a few moments. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It started with Aunt Pole. Ruby tilted her head. Aunt Pole? Garion nodded. Polgara, sorceress, daughter of Belgarath. She's basically the reason I survived childhood. Belgarath snorted softly from across the fire. That's probably true, Garion chuckled. She's terrifying when she's angry. How angry? Nora asked. Garion thought about it. Imagine if Glinda could turn into a giant wolf and had 3,000 years of experience. The entire group went silent. Pyrrha blinked. That's a frightening thought. It is, Garion agreed. Can she turn into a wolf too? Ruby asked excitedly. A wolf? Yes. Pretty much any animal one can imagine. However, like with your semblances, shape-shifting for sorcerers is very much about personality and preference. Garion grinned. Her primary animal that she turns into is a snowy white owl. Ruby's eyes widened. That's so cool. Belgarath rolled his eyes. It encourages her when people react like that. The group laughed. Garion leaned back slightly. Then there was Dernick. His smile softened. He's a blacksmith. A blacksmith? Jean asked. Garion nodded. The best man I've ever known. Something in his tone caused everyone to listen more closely. He isn't a warrior, isn't a king, isn't a sorcerer. Most of the time he was just trying to keep the rest of us fed and out of trouble. Belgarath quietly puffed on his pipe. Garion noticed. Then he continued. Then there is Barak. Ruby perked up. What's he like? Garion laughed. Imagine if Nora was 6.5 feet tall. Nora looked delighted and had a giant red beard. Nora looked even more delighted and could turn into a bear. Nora immediately became ecstatic. He was a Cherik warrior, loud, brave, sometimes reckless. Sounds familiar, Ren observed. Nora nodded proudly. I like him already. Most people do, Garion smiled. Unless they were standing on the opposite side of a battlefield. The fire crackled. Then there was Mandorallen. The name alone sounded noble. Jean tilted his head. What was he like? Garion immediately sat up straighter and deepened his voice. Fear not, noble companions, for I shall smite yon villain with righteous vigor. The group erupted into laughter. Even Pyrrha couldn't suppress a giggle. Garion grinned. That's actually pretty close, Silk said. He talked like that all the time? Ruby asked. All the time, Garion nodded. He was the greatest knight in the world, completely fearless. Belgarath coughed, mostly because he wasn't bright enough to recognize danger. More laughter followed. Garion continued. There was Hetar. Now Garion's smile became genuine. He was from Algaria. A warrior, Ren asked. The best horseman I've ever seen. Garion nodded. I honestly think he understood horses better than people. Ruby laughed. That's saying something. It is. Garion agreed. That's because he can actually talk to horses. Everyone sat with mouths open, astonished. Ruby leaned forward eagerly. Who else? There was Relg. The group immediately noticed Garion's expression change. Oh, Jean asked. Garion scratched his cheek. He was complicated. Complicated how? Nora asked. He was a religious fanatic who spent most of the journey convinced everyone was going to corrupt him. Garion said with a slight exasperation. The group stared. That sounds exhausting, Ren observed. Finally, Ruby glanced toward the small Dresnian. What about Silk? Garion's grin widened. Silk immediately knew he was in trouble. Oh no. Oh yes. Garion pointed across the fire. Prince Keldar of Drasnia. The entire group froze. Ruby blinked. Prince Jorn blinked. Wait. Pyrrha blinked. Prince? Silk sighed heavily. I knew this would happen eventually. Garion laughed. Spy, merchant, con artist, occasional thief, alleged thief, Silk corrected. Constant complainer. Reasonable critic, one of my closest friends. Silk's expression softened slightly. The fire crackled. For a few moments, Garion simply looked around the circle. So yeah, he smiled. I have a team. His gaze drifted toward the stars overhead, a strange one. Then he looked back at the friends gathered around the campfire. But I think all the best ones are. Hundreds of miles away, another young man was having trouble sleeping. For weeks, Oscar Pine had suffered from increasingly strange headaches. At first, he had dismissed them as exhaustion. Life on the small family farm in rural Anima demanded long days and early mornings. Headaches were hardly unusual, but these were different. Sometimes he would find himself staring at a tool and suddenly know exactly how it worked, despite never having used one before. Other times he would awaken in the middle of the night with unfamiliar memories lingering at the edge of his thoughts. Ancient stone halls, towering academies, conversations with people he had never met, even battles he had never fought. They came as fleeting flashes before fading away like mist. The worst part was the feeling, the constant sensation that someone was standing just behind him, watching, waiting, patient. Oscar had told no one. How could he? The very idea sounded insane. So he endured it in silence. Every day the headaches worsened. Every day the strange thoughts became more frequent. Every day the presence felt closer, and on this particular morning it finally reached its breaking point. The barn was quiet except for the sounds of livestock stirring in their stalls. Oscar carried a bucket beneath one arm as he moved between the rows. Sunlight filtered through the wooden slats. Dust drifted lazily through golden beams of light. For a few precious moments he almost felt normal. Then the buzzing returned and he winced. The bucket nearly slipped from his grasp. Not again. The pressure behind his eyes intensified. Oscar stumbled toward a nearby support beam and leaned against it. His gaze drifted upward. A small mirror hung from one of the wooden posts, and he stared at his reflection. The farm boy staring back looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes, tense shoulders, and worry etched across his face. Then he heard a voice. "Hello, Oscar." The bucket slipped from his fingers. It crashed against the floor. Water splashed across the wooden planks. Oscar spun around, but nobody was there. The barn stood empty. The animals remained calm. His heart immediately began racing. Who's there?" Silence. Then the voice spoke again. Calm, measured, gentle. "My apologies." Oscar backed away. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It was inside his head. I realized this must be rather alarming. Oscar stumbled backward and fell into a pile of hay. Fear surged through him. What is happening? A pause followed. Not uncomfortable, merely thoughtful. As I said, the voice sounded almost embarrassed. "This is somewhat disconcerting for me as well." Oscar stared into empty space. His pulse thundered in his ears. Finally, he managed to force the question out. "Who are you?" The answer came immediately. "My name is Ozpin." Oscar froze, and somewhere deep within his mind, he felt the ancient soul stir. Far to the northeast, beyond the kingdoms of men, lay a land abandoned by hope. Jagged mountains clawed at perpetually dark skies. The earth itself seemed wounded. Nothing grew there. No birds sang. No animals wandered its barren wastes. Only grim, countless grim. Creatures born from darkness moved endlessly across the black landscape, and at the center of that desolation stood a fortress of obsidian and stone. Ancient, silent, waiting. Within its halls, a gathering was already underway. A long table dominated the chamber. Seated around it were the servants of the most dangerous being on Remnant. Arthur Watts adjusted his spectacles while studying a collection of reports across from him. Sat Hazel Reynard. The giant remained silent as always, massive hands folded before him. Tyrion Callows lounged carelessly in his chair, an unsettling grin permanently fixed upon his face. Standing nearby were Emerald Sustri and Mercury Black. Neither appeared particularly comfortable. Both remained close to a seated figure at the end of the table. Cinder fall. The former infiltrator bore little resemblance to the confident woman who had orchestrated Beacon's destruction. A dark patch covered her left eye. Burn scars marred part of her face. One gloved hand clenched the armrest tightly enough to whiten her knuckles. Most humiliating of all, she still could not properly speak. The injuries inflicted during Beacon's fall continued to linger. Watts glanced up from his reports. A faint smile touched his lips. Pathetic. Mercury visibly tensed. Emerald narrowed her eyes. Watts continued. One would assume possession of the Fall Maiden's power would make failure less likely. Cinder's remaining eye snapped toward him. Pure hatred burned within it. Tyrion immediately began laughing, a high-pitched, delighted sound. "Oh, Arthur, that's cruel." His grin widened. "Accurate, but cruel," Tyrion mused. Emerald took a step forward. Mercury quickly caught her arm. Cinder merely continued staring. If looks could kill, Watts would have been dead several times over. The scientist appeared completely unconcerned. Then the chamber doors opened. Every conversation ceased instantly. Salem entered. Silence followed her like a shadow. Even Watts lowered his gaze. The immortal queen moved toward the head of the table. Graceful, terrifying, absolute. She regarded each of her followers in turn. Finally, she spoke. "The kingdoms are slowly recovering after the fall of Beacon." Her pale eyes settled upon Watts. "Atlas?" Watts immediately straightened. "Ironwood remains isolated and paranoid." A smug smile appeared. "The embargo continues to generate tension throughout the kingdoms." "Good." Salem's attention shifted. It shifted toward Tyrion. The Faunus immediately straightened. "My queen, there is another task requiring your talents." Tyrion's grin widened. "Anything." Salem slowly circled the table. "Intelligence gathered over the past year suggests the Spring Maiden resides somewhere within one of the bandit tribes on Anima." Tyrion's yellow eyes gleamed. "A maiden, perhaps?" Salem stopped. "But whether she is the maiden herself or merely connected to her, I want answers." Tyrion placed a hand over his chest and bowed deeply. "It would be my pleasure." Salem's gaze moved on. "Hazel," the massive man lifted his head. "You will continue preparations within Mistral. Continue to work with Adam Taurus to ensure we have full support of the White Fang. A single nod, as you wish." Hazel had never been a man of many words. Finally, Salem's eyes settled upon Cinder. Silence fell over the chamber. Cinder sat rigidly in her chair. One eye was hidden beneath a dark patch, while her remaining good eye burned with frustration, with humiliation, with rage. She turned towards Emerald and with extreme pain whispered into her ear. Salem regarded her for several moments, then looked toward Emerald. "Speak, child," Emerald hesitated. Mercury quietly shifted his stance. Cinder's hand tightened into a fist. Emerald swallowed. "Cinder asks." She glanced nervously toward her partner. "What about the girl?" The room became still. Tyrion's grin widened. Watts raised an eyebrow. Emerald continued. "The one with the silver eyes." Cinder immediately nodded. Hatred flashed across her face, the memory of those silver eyes, the burning pain and the darkness, the humiliation. Salem remained silent for several moments. Then she spoke. "No." The answer was immediate, final. Cinder's expression darkened. Emerald looked surprised. "My queen?" Salem turned toward the great windows overlooking the wasteland beyond. "Ruby Rose travels with Crow Branwen." She raised one pale hand. "She travels with the survivors of Beacon." Another finger. "And now she travels with 3 strangers whose capabilities remain largely unknown." Images flashed briefly through Salem's thoughts. An ancient sorcerer, a young king carrying a mysterious jewel, a clever schemer whose mind never seemed to stop moving. Pieces she did not yet fully understand. To pursue Ruby now would gain us little. Her gaze hardened and risk much. Cinder visibly bristled. Salem looked back at her. "Don't allow emotion to cloud your judgment." The words struck harder than any blow. "The girl lives because she is presently irrelevant." Silence followed. Cinder lowered her gaze, not in agreement, but in obedience. For now, Salem continued, our attention belongs elsewhere. Slowly she turned toward the south, towards Mistral, towards Haven Academy, towards the next battlefield. A faint smile touched her lips. Beacon has fallen. No one spoke. No one moved. The Queen's voice echoed through the chamber. And Haven will be next. Chapter 5. Steps Forward. The weeks following the fall of Beacon had not been easy for any of Team RWBY. Though separated by entire oceans and kingdoms, each of them struggled in their own way to move beyond the tragedy that had forever changed their lives. For young Xiaolong, that struggle began on a couch on the island of Patch. Yang sat silently in the living room, staring at the television without truly seeing it. News reports continued to cycle through stories about Vale's reconstruction, grim sightings, missing persons, and ongoing investigations into the events surrounding Beacon Academy. None of it mattered. The remote rested loosely in her hand. The sleeve of her sweatshirt hung empty where her right arm had once been. The room felt quiet, too quiet. Then the front door suddenly opened. Tai Yang's voice carried through the house. For the first time in days, there was excitement in it. Yang glanced toward the hallway as her father entered, carrying several bags and a large rectangular package. He set the package down carefully. A grin spread across his face. "This one's for you." Yang looked at the box. Something about its size and shape made her stomach tighten. Slowly, she pulled herself upright and approached. Her father remained silent as she opened it. The moment she saw what was inside, her breath caught. A metallic arm, beautifully engineered, sleek, powerful, Atlas craftsmanship. For several moments she simply stared. Neither joy nor excitement appeared on her face, only numbness. Taiyang's smile faded slightly, not from disappointment, from understanding. Yang reached out with her remaining hand and gently touched the metal fingers. The arm looked real. Almost too real, a reminder of everything she had lost. After a long silence, she closed the case. "Thank you, Dad." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Tai Yang nodded. "You don't have to try it on today." Yang looked down at the box. "No," she swallowed. "I'm not ready yet." Her father simply rested a hand on her shoulder, and together they left the arm where it sat. Waiting, several days passed. The package remained in Yang's room, unopened, untouched. The arm lingered in the back of her thoughts, a possibility she still wasn't prepared to face. One morning she sat upstairs reading when voices drifted up from below. At first she ignored them, then she recognized one and then another, and still another. Curious, she descended the stairs. The sight that greeted her immediately stopped her. Dr. Oobleck sat at the kitchen table, animatedly explaining something while gesturing wildly with a coffee mug. Professor Port occupied a nearby chair, looking deeply offended. Tai Yang sat beside them with an amused expression. Standing near the counter was Glinda Goodwitch. Yang blinked. "Glinda!" The huntress turned. A small smile appeared. Miss Xiaolong, Professor Port immediately rose. "Ah, there she is!" Dr. Oobleck nearly spilled his coffee. "Excellent! Perfect timing." Yang couldn't help herself. "What are you all doing here?" "Checking on a student," Glinda answered calmly. "An exceptionally stubborn student," Oobleck added. Port nodded gravely. "The most stubborn kind." Yang rolled her eyes. For the next hour, conversation flowed through the kitchen, mostly nonsense. Professor Port launched into a story involving a Beowulf attack that seemed to grow more exaggerated with each retelling. Dr. Oobleck interrupted repeatedly to correct historical inaccuracies. Port argued back. Oobleck argued harder. Tai Yang quietly enjoyed every second. Even Glinda occasionally contributed a dry remark that sent the discussion spiraling into new directions. For the first time in weeks, Yang found herself laughing. A genuine laugh. The sound surprised her. It surprised everyone. The conversation slowly quieted. Glinda studied her carefully. "How are you feeling?" Yang hesitated. Her gaze drifted toward the stairs, toward the room above, toward the unopened case. Several moments passed. Then she stood. Nobody said anything as she walked upstairs. When she returned, she carried the case. The kitchen became silent. Yang opened it. The metallic arm gleamed beneath the light. Slowly she lifted it. Her pulse quickened. For a brief moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. Then she remembered Beacon, her friends, everything she had lost, and everything she still had. Taking a steady breath, she attached the arm. The mechanisms clicked softly into place. She flexed her shoulder. The fingers moved perfectly. The wrist rotated smoothly. The hand opened, closed, opened again. Yang stared. Astonishment slowly spread across her face. It feels... She turned the hand over, watching the fingers move, like a part of me. No one spoke. For several moments, Yang simply stared at her new arm. Then she looked up. Her father was smiling, not broadly, not triumphantly, just quietly, proudly. Taiyang nodded once. Good. Yang glanced back down at the arm. The metallic fingers curled into a fist before relaxing once more. Taiyang leaned back in his chair. Now we can get to work. Thousands of miles away, Weiss Schnee sat alone in her bedroom. Snow drifted outside the mansion windows, and the sprawling Schnee estate remained as immaculate and sterile as ever. To Weiss, it felt like a prison. Weeks had passed since Beacon. Weeks since she had returned home. Weeks since everything had fallen apart. Her thoughts drifted back over recent events. The charity concert, the endless gathering of Atlas elites, the shallow conversations, the self-congratulation, the complete inability of those present to understand what had happened in Vale. She remembered her anger, her frustration, the explosion of emotion she could no longer contain. Then her father, the argument, his attempt to physically restrain her, and the sudden manifestation of her summoning. A power she had never fully mastered. The result had been immediate, grounded, confined, restricted to the estate. Jacques Schnee had called it discipline. Weiss called it imprisonment. A knock sounded at the door. Moments later, Klein entered carrying a tray. "Good afternoon, young miss." Weiss offered a faint smile. Klein, the butler, placed the tray nearby. His shifting colored eyes studied her. "You appear to be attempting a staring contest with the window." Weiss sighed. "The window is winning." Klein chuckled softly. A brief silence followed. Then he spoke again. "Perhaps young miss should focus her attention on something more productive." Weiss frowned thoughtfully. Klein merely smiled. Food for thought. Then he quietly excused himself. After he left, the room grew silent once more. Weiss sat motionless, thinking. Eventually her gaze drifted toward Myrtenaster, toward the power she had never fully mastered, summoning. It was a challenge, a goal, something she could control. Slowly determination replaced frustration. If she was trapped here, she would use the time wisely. The next several days became a blur. Practice, failure, more practice, more failure. Glyphs flashed throughout the room. Furniture was pushed aside. The floor became scarred with training marks. Again and again Weiss attempted to summon. Again and again the effort collapsed, but she refused to stop. Each failure only strengthened her resolve. Finally, power surged through the room, and a massive glyph erupted beneath her feet. A sudden wind howled, and light filled the chamber. And from that light emerged a towering armored knight. The armor Gigas, fully formed, majestic, powerful. It stood silently within her room. Weiss stared, breathing heavily, in many ways still disbelieving. A loud crash echoed through the mansion. Moments later, her bedroom door burst open and Klein stood in the doorway. The butler rushed inside, then immediately stopped. His eyes widened. Towering over Weiss stood the enormous spectral knight. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Klein adjusted his glasses. "Well," he looked the summon up and down. "That appears somewhat larger than the one you took down in your trial." Despite herself, Weiss laughed. A genuine smile spread across her face, the first in weeks. The armor Gigas slowly dissolved into shimmering particles. Exhausted but triumphant, Weiss sank into a nearby chair. "Klein." "Yes, young miss?" Weiss looked toward the window, towards the world beyond the mansion walls. Determination burned in her eyes. "I need a favor far to the south." Another member of Team RWBY had spent the past several weeks running from Beacon, running from Adam, running from her mistakes. Blake Belladonna had scarcely paused long enough to think. She had boarded the first ship she could find, determined to return home, determined to leave everything else behind. Unfortunately, Sun Wukong had other plans. She had discovered him stowed away aboard the ship less than a day into the voyage. The resulting argument had lasted nearly an hour. Sun remained entirely unapologetic. Blake remained entirely annoyed. Neither had changed the other's mind. By the time Menagerie finally appeared on the horizon, Blake had accepted that she wasn't making the journey alone. Now the pair stood before a familiar house. Blake stared at the door. Nervousness twisted within her chest. Sun glanced sideways. "You gonna knock?" Blake shot him a look, then raised her hand. The door opened. For several seconds, nobody moved. Callie Belladonna's eyes widened. "Blake." The next instant, she wrapped her daughter in a crushing embrace. Blake barely had time to react. "Mom! Oh, look at you!" A deep laugh sounded from inside. Gira Belladonna appeared. The towering former high leader of the White Fang and now leader of the Farnus on Menagerie stopped in the doorway. Relief immediately washed across his features. "Welcome home, Blake." For the first time since Beacon, Blake felt safe. Later that evening, the family sat together enjoying tea. Sun joined them. The mood remained warm, comforting. But eventually, conversation turned toward Beacon. The atmosphere changed. Blake described what had happened. The fall, the attack, the grim, the chaos. Several times emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Sun quietly filled in details when she struggled, including the parts she wished she could forget. The White Fang was there. Gira's expression darkened. They helped organize the attack. Sun nodded. They brought Grim into the city. Silence settled over the room. Kali looked shocked. Gira looked troubled. Very troubled. Later that evening, another meeting took place elsewhere within the Belladonna residence. The Albane brothers sat calmly across from Gira. Their expressions remained composed, polite, careful. Questions were asked, answers were given, yet something felt wrong. Too many half-truths, too many evasions, too many carefully chosen words. Finally, Gira asked a simple question, and Adam Taurus. For the briefest moment, the brothers exchanged a glance, a tiny reaction, almost imperceptible. But Gira noticed. The meeting ended shortly afterward. The brothers departed. The door closed behind them. Silence filled the room. Slowly, Gira walked toward a nearby window. Outside, the ocean stretched toward the horizon. The former high leader stared into the distance, deep in thought, disturbed by what he had heard, and perhaps even more disturbed by what he had not elsewhere in the house. Blake and Sun sat quietly. Neither spoke, neither needed to, for both of them understood the same thing. The troubles that had begun in Vale had not ended with Beacon's fall. In many ways, they were only beginning. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Dark. The town was little more than a crossroads settlement tucked between rolling hills and dense forest. After the destruction of Shion village, however, it looked almost luxurious. Lanterns glowed warmly from windows. The smell of cooking drifted through the evening air, and for the first time in days, everyone could look forward to sleeping indoors. Nora stretched dramatically. "If this place has real beds, I may never leave." "You said that at the last inn," Ren replied. "And I meant it then too." Ruby laughed as Jean worked with the innkeeper to secure rooms for the group. Before long, everyone had settled into the common room. Belgariad claimed a chair beside the fireplace. Garion found himself answering yet another round of questions from Ruby regarding the strange creatures and peoples of his world. Pyrrha sat quietly nearby, listening more than speaking. Crow stood near a window overlooking the street, drink in hand. Then a raven landed on the sill. Only he seemed to notice. The bird tilted its head, and Crow sighed heavily. Ruby looked up. Something wrong? Nope. He pushed away from the wall, just taking a walk. Belgariad glanced briefly toward the raven. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, curiosity. Then the old sorcerer returned his attention to packing his pipe. Crow stepped outside. The raven immediately took flight. Prince Keldar noticed. Of course he noticed. Years spent surviving the royal courts of Drasnia and the world's largest intelligence service, where everyone in the kingdom is assumed to be a spy, had taught him that people revealed far more through what they tried to hide than what they openly displayed. A raven arrives. Crow leaves. No explanation, no destination. Interesting. Several minutes later, Silk quietly slipped out the door. No one noticed, which was exactly how he preferred it. Crow then made his way through several narrow streets before stopping at a smaller inn on the edge of town. Silk remained concealed in the shadows across the street. Patient, watching, he opened the door and a woman stood just inside. She was tall, dark-haired, a confidence bordering on arrogance, and most importantly, dangerous. She wore red and black, no visible weapons, which somehow made her seem even more threatening. Crow folded his arms. "You're late," the woman said with a focused intensity. After a pause, Crow rolled his eyes. "Good to see you too, Raven." Silk raised an eyebrow. Crow's sister, Yang's mother. Now things were becoming considerably more interesting. The inn was nearly empty. Raven sat first, and Crow reluctantly joined her. For several moments neither spoke. Years of history lingered between them. Finally, Raven broke the silence. "I heard Yang got her new arm." Crow's expression immediately darkened. "Funny that you should take the time to investigate that when normally you don't even bother to care about what is happening at all with your own daughter." Raven shrugged. "I saved her once." Crow leaned forward and raised his index finger. "Once," he said, "real Mom of the Year material." Crow paused a moment as Raven's eyes flared. "What do you want?" he asked. Raven's eyes sharpened. "I heard rumors about Beacon," Crow snorted. "A little late. Not those rumors," Raven said with exasperation. Silence settled between them. Raven's gaze never wavered. Finally she asked, "Does Salem have it?" Crow immediately knew what she meant. "No." The slightest tension left Raven's shoulders. Silk noticed. Crow noticed. Interesting, very interesting, Silk thought to himself. Crow decided it was his turn. "I heard my own rumors too, so perhaps you might like to tell me where the Spring Maiden is?" Raven smiled. Not warmly, not mockingly, knowingly. "You know something?" Crow pushed. "Maybe," said Raven. She went on, "I hear things. You always hear things," Crow retorted. "And you're always asking questions. You know where she is." Raven leaned back in her chair. "I didn't say that." No, she hadn't. But she also hadn't denied it, which told Crow more than enough. Their conversation continued for nearly half an hour. Questions, half answers, warnings. Neither fully trusted the other, neither entirely lied. Eventually Raven stood. "I should go." Crow rose. "That's it. What were you expecting?" "The truth would have been nice." Raven laughed softly. The truth usually gets people killed. Then reality itself seemed to bend. Silk's eyes widened. A crimson portal tore open behind Raven. Not sorcery. Her semblance, perhaps. Something entirely different. Crow wasn't surprised, which made it even more concerning. Raven stepped toward it, then paused. "Be careful, brother." Crow barked out a laugh. "You're telling me to be careful?" For just a moment, her expression softened. Then it disappeared. She stepped through, and the portal vanished, leaving only silence. An hour later, Crow returned to the group's inn. Most were gathered around the common room. Everyone, it appeared, except Silk. Crow sat down heavily. Ruby immediately looked up. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Crow replied. Then the door opened, and a stranger entered. Nobody recognized him. Several hands instinctively moved toward weapons. The stranger smiled as he walked up to their table, then his face began to change. Ruby nearly dropped her drink. John stared. Nora squealed in delight. His cheeks shifted, jaw narrowed, and nose appeared to lengthen. Within seconds, Prince Keldar stood before them. Silk swept a theatrical bow. "Good evening. That is so cool," Nora shouted. Belgarath puffed his pipe. "Show off," Silk grinned. Then he turned toward Crow. "You know, I met a fascinating woman tonight." Crow froze and Silk's smile widened. Dark hair. Crow closed his eyes. Red and black clothing. A rather impressive grim mask that held red eyes behind it. Belgarath looked up, interested. "The mask wasn't decorative either," Silk continued. "People don't carry something like that unless they wear it regularly." Crow sighed heavily. "You followed me?" Silk folded his arms. "You vanished mysteriously, and I am a trained spy, you know." Several minutes later, everyone was alert around a large table. Crow looked defeated and fully aware there was no point in hiding things now. "Fine," he said. Ruby immediately leaned forward. "What was all that about?" Crow rubbed his face. "The woman was Raven." "Yang's mom?" Jean asked. That revelation alone generated a dozen questions. Crow ignored them. "The bottom line is that she confirmed something I've been worried about," he said, "the whereabouts of the Spring Maiden." Pyrrha frowned. "What did she say?" Ruby piped up. "That she knows something," Crow replied. "Like perhaps where she is, and maybe who's protecting her. Either way, she's involved." Silk's eyes gleamed mischievously. "And the relic?" Belgarath came alert. The room grew quiet. Crow nodded slowly. "Right." He leaned back in his chair. "There are 4 relics." Everyone went silent. "One for each kingdom. One for each of the primary foundations of humanity." Ruby blinked. "What kind of artifacts?" "The old stories say humanity was created to embody 4 principles." Crow began counting on his fingers. Knowledge, choice, creation, destruction. Belgarath lowered his pipe. "Those weren't objects. They were foundational elements. The relics represent those principles," Crow continued. "Beacon protected the relic of choice. Haven protects the relic of knowledge. Atlas guards the relic of creation. Vacuo protects the relic of destruction. Garion unconsciously touched the orb hidden beneath his tunic." Silk noticed. So did Belgarath. Powerful relics had a way of attracting trouble. "Why does Salem want them?" Jean asked. Crow shook his head. "I don't know exactly. I know Ozpin considered them critical. I know Salem has spent centuries trying to obtain them, and I know if she ever gets all 4 together." He stopped. Ruby waited. "What happens?" Crow stared into the fire. "I don't fully know, and frankly, I'd rather never find out." Much later, everyone retired for the evening. Everyone except Belgarath. The old sorcerer sat beside the dying fire, pipe glowing softly, thinking, relics, maidens, ancient powers, hidden wars, immortal enemies, knowledge, choice, creation, destruction. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. Unfortunately, it was a picture he wasn't certain he liked. A stream of smoke drifted upward. "Interesting." The word was quiet, thoughtful. Belgarath stared into the dying embers. Then, after a moment, he added, "And that usually means trouble." Chapter 7. Echoes of the Past. The morning sun had only just begun to crest the eastern horizon when Oscar Pine adjusted the strap of his pack and continued walking down the dusty road. Behind him, the small farm where he had spent his entire life was slowly disappearing into the distance. Ahead lay uncertainty. Ahead lay Mistral. Ahead lay answers, or so he hoped. Oscar kicked a loose stone from the road and watched it bounce into the grass. For a while, there was only the sound of his boots against the dirt and the chirping of birds greeting the dawn. Then the voice spoke. "You can still turn around." Oscar sighed. A few weeks ago, he might have jumped. Now he merely rolled his eyes. Would it change anything? Silence lingered for several moments. Then, no. Oscar frowned. At least Ozpin was honest. That was something. The boy continued walking. The farm was gone from sight now. Nothing but open countryside stretched behind him. Finally, he asked the question that had haunted him ever since the mysterious voice had first appeared in his mind. How much of me is left? The answer did not come immediately. I can't say exactly, but it is not an overnight process. Oscar stopped walking. What do you mean by that? I mean that I can't remember how long it takes each time, but the transition isn't immediate or fast. For the first time, there was something resembling sadness in Ozpin's voice. And even after all this time, I still do not fully understand the process. It was my choice to come back and face Salem, but not my choice in how that would happen. Oscar stared at the road. That wasn't comforting. Not even a little. You mean eventually we're just... He couldn't finish the sentence. Ozpin did it for him. Our souls merged as one. Oscar swallowed. The thought terrified him. Not death. Not danger. Not even the responsibility Ozpin kept hinting at. Losing himself. That was what frightened him. The idea that one day he might look in a mirror and no longer know where Oscar Pine ended and Ozpin began. He resumed walking. What if I don't want that? Then you are no different than every person who came before you. Oscar was quiet. Then, after several moments, I always wanted more. More, to leave the farm. Oscar kicked another stone. See the world. Do something important. A bitter laugh escaped him. Guess I should have been more specific. To his surprise, Ozpin chuckled softly. Be careful what you wish for. Oscar shook his head. Yeah. For a while neither spoke. Eventually the distant silhouette of a train station appeared on the horizon. Oscar stared at it. His future waited somewhere beyond those tracks, whether he liked it or not. Finally, he adjusted his pack and continued forward. I still don't know if I trust you. I understand, but I can't think of a better option. Ozpin said nothing, and for now, that was enough. Several hundred miles away, two figures moved silently through the forests of Anima, or rather, one figure and one bird. Belgariad padded through the underbrush in the form of a large, silver-frosted wolf. Above him, a black crow circled lazily through the morning sky. The unusual scouting partnership had become increasingly common over the previous week. Belgariad had always known that covering ground as a wolf was considerably faster than walking. Crow had discovered that scouting beside a shape-shifting sorcerer from another universe was strangely enjoyable. Neither would have admitted this aloud. The crow landed on a branch. A moment later, Crow resumed his human form. You smell that? Belgariad lifted his head. His golden wolf eyes narrowed. Death. Crow grimaced. That's what I was afraid of. The pair continued forward. The smell grew stronger. Soon they emerged into a small clearing. The remains of a farmstead sat before them, or what was left of it. Buildings had been smashed, fences torn apart. The ground itself looked churned by violence. No bodies remained, only bloodstains. Crow's expression darkened. Another one. Belgariad examined the tracks. Several grim had clearly passed through. Beowulfs, boar batusks, creeps. Yet another trail stood apart from the rest, large, unnatural. Deep impressions scarred the earth. The old sorcerer frowned. What manner of creature leaves tracks like these? Crow stared at them. His face slowly hardened. I've seen it before. Belgariad looked up. It? Crow's voice was unusually serious. I don't think you're going to like the answer. The trail led them north, through dense forests, across streams, past abandoned homesteads. Every mile brought fresh signs of destruction. By mid-afternoon they found it. Even Belgariad stopped dead. The creature stood nearly 12 feet tall. Its lower half resembled a monstrous horse. Its upper body was that of a pale, elongated humanoid fused grotesquely onto its back. Its arms dragged nearly to the ground. Its face was a nightmare given form. For several moments neither man spoke. Then Belgariad finally said, That may be the ugliest thing I have ever seen. And I've fought Algroths, coming from Belgariad, that was saying something. The creature turned, it saw them, and screamed. The sound echoed through the forest. Crow immediately drew Harbinger. "Oh, good!" Belgariad's wolf, lips peeled back. "I take it this is your RWBY." Unfortunately, the Grim charged. Trees exploded apart beneath its advance. Crow met it head-on. Harbinger transformed into scythe form, the weapon carved through black flesh. The Grim roared. Belgariad spoke a single word. The ground erupted beneath the creature. Roots and stones surged upward, tangling its limbs. For a moment, only a moment, the RWBY tore free. But that moment was enough. Crow's scythe flashed. The Grim staggered. Belgariad resumed human form. He raised his hands and began to draw in his will. With a single word, he pointed at the Grim. The word struck like visible thunder. The Grim froze. Cracks spread through its body. Dark energy burst outward. A second later, the creature exploded into black ash. Silence returned to the forest. Crow slowly lowered his weapon. Belgariad stared at the drifting remains. "Hideous," Crow laughed. "That's your takeaway." "It is." That evening, the group sat around a campfire beneath a canopy of stars. Dinner was nearly finished when Crow casually remarked, "We found the source of those tracks." Ruby looked up. "What was it?" Crow shrugged. "A Grim." Belgariad puffed on his pipe. "A horse." Everyone waited, with a man growing out of its back. Silence. Then Ren froze. The color drained from his face. Nora's smile vanished. Pyrrha immediately noticed. "Ren." Ren stared into the flames. His voice was barely above a whisper. "The RWBY." The entire camp grew quiet. Crow's expression softened. "Yeah." Nora lowered her eyes. For the first time since any of them had met her, she looked genuinely sad. Ruby glanced between them. "You know it?" Ren nodded slowly. "It destroyed my village." Then he added, "And it killed my parents." The fire crackled softly. No one interrupted. Ren rarely spoke about his past. Tonight was different. And as the stars slowly wheeled overhead, Ren and Nora began telling their story. Chapter 8. Moving forward. The sound of fists striking echoed across the small training yard behind the Xiaolong home. Yang barely had time to raise her mechanical arm before Taiyang's foot swept beneath her legs. The world tilted. A moment later, she landed flat on her back in the grass. For several seconds, she simply stared up at the blue sky. Then she groaned again. Standing over her with a grin that was far too amused for her liking, Taiyang shrugged again. Yang sat up and brushed dirt from her clothes. Over the past month, she had become accustomed to the Atlas prosthetic. What had once felt alien and intimidating now felt almost natural. The metal fingers obeyed her thoughts as readily as her flesh and blood hand once had. Almost. There were still moments when she caught herself staring at it, moments when she remembered exactly why she needed it, moments when she saw Adam Taurus standing over her once more. Those moments were becoming fewer, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Yang rolled her shoulders and resumed her fighting stance. "Okay," she said, "no holding back this time." Taiyang laughed. "That's what you said the last 6 times." Yang lunged. This time she didn't simply charge. She feinted left. Taiyang shifted. Yang then pivoted and drove a punch toward his ribs. For a brief moment she thought she'd caught him. Then somehow her father wasn't there anymore. A hand landed on her shoulder. A gentle shove sent her stumbling forward. Too predictable. Yang spun around. "How?" Taiyang crossed his arms. "Because you're still fighting the same way." "What way?" Yang responded. "The way you've always fought," Taiyang said casually. Yang frowned, and Taiyang pointed at her. "You always rely on being stronger." He pointed at her mechanical arm. "Your focus is always on hitting harder." Then he tapped the side of his head. "But you forget to use this." Yang's expression darkened. "I use my head." Sometimes the answer came far too quickly. Taiyang continued. "You're one of the strongest huntresses I've ever seen. But strength isn't enough." He stepped closer. "When you get angry, you stop thinking. The words struck harder than any punch because deep down she knew they were true. She remembered Beacon, she remembered Adam, she remembered charging him, remembered losing. Tai Yang must have seen the change in her face as his expression softened. "I'm not saying don't use your emotions." He gestured toward her. "Your fire is part of who you are." Then he smiled. "I'm saying don't let it drive the car." For a long moment neither spoke. Finally, Yang sighed. "I hate it when you're right. Get used to it." They resumed sparring. This time Yang forced herself to slow down, to think, to watch, to wait. Several exchanges later, Tai Yang nodded approvingly. "Better," Yang smiled. The first genuine smile she'd worn in a long time. Hours later, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, father and daughter sat beneath the shade of a large tree with bottles of water resting beside them. For a while, they simply enjoyed the quiet. Then Tai Yang spoke. "You've been thinking about her again." Yang didn't need to ask who he meant. She stared at the ground. The silence was answer enough. Tai Yang nodded. "I figured." The wind rustled through the leaves overhead. Yang finally looked up. "You ever wonder why she left?" Tai Yang chuckled softly. "Almost every day." That wasn't the answer she expected. For years she had imagined her father eventually reaching a point where he understood Raven. Apparently he hadn't, not completely. Tai Yang leaned back against the tree. "Your mother always walked her own path." A faint smile crossed his face, even when it drove everyone else crazy. Yang looked away. Part of her was angry. Part of her was curious. Part of her simply wanted answers. Tai Yang studied her for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "If you decide to find her someday," Yang looked up. "I won't stop you." The words hung between them. Tai Yang smiled faintly. "You deserve your own answers." For a long moment, Yang stared at him. Then, at the mechanical arm resting on her knee, she flexed the fingers, opened them, closed them. The movement felt natural now, comfortable. Like a part of her, Tai Yang rose to his feet. "Good." Yang looked up. "Good." He grinned. "Now we can get back to work." Thousands of miles away, beneath the tropical skies of Menagerie, Blake Belladonna leaned against the railing of the second-floor balcony overlooking her family's estate. The evening air was warm, the sea breeze pleasant. Normally it would have been peaceful. Today it wasn't. Son stood nearby, arms crossed, expression frustrated. "Blake, we've been here for weeks," she sighed. "Here we go again. We've talked about this." "No, you've talked about it." Son pointed toward the horizon. "We know something's happening. We suspect. We know." Blake rubbed her temples. The argument felt familiar. Lately they seemed to have one every few days. Son wasn't wrong, and that was the problem. The White Fang had participated in the fall of Beacon. Adam was still out there. Something was happening, but she had no idea what, and no idea where to begin. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Son just shook his head. "We can't just sit around waiting." Before Blake could answer, movement caught her eye. A flash of color among the trees, brown hair, a figure partially concealed among the branches watching them. The figure froze. For a split second, Blake saw skin coloration shift instinctively. Then the person turned and ran. Blake's eyes widened. Ilya, Son, spun around. "What?" But Blake was already moving. She vaulted over the railing, landing gracefully below, and sprinted after the fleeing figure. Son followed immediately. The chase tore through the outskirts of Kuakwana, across rooftops and over walls, and through narrow alleys. Ilya moved with desperate speed, but Blake knew her, knew how she thought, knew how she moved. They gained ground slowly, relentlessly. Finally, they cornered her atop a rooftop overlooking the city. Ilya stopped, breathing heavily, her weapon already drawn. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Blake stepped forward. "Ilya." The chameleon faunus didn't answer. Blake's heart sank. Seeing her again brought back memories she wasn't prepared for. Memories of a different White Fang, a different friendship, a different life. "You don't have to do this." Ilya laughed bitterly. You still don't understand. Her skin shifted colors with her emotions. Fear, anger, regret, all visible at once. You shouldn't have come back. Sun moved subtly to the side, positioning himself, preparing. Blake took another step. Tell me what's happening. No. Ilya, no. The outburst echoed across the rooftops. For a moment, silence returned. Then Sun moved. Golden clones erupted forward. Ilya reacted instantly. Her weapon slashed, destroying one clone. Then another, and then another. But the distraction had worked. A scroll flew from her hand. Blake caught it. Ilya's eyes widened. Panic flashed across her face. She lunged. Sun intercepted her. The impact shook the rooftop. For one brief moment it looked as though he had succeeded. Then Ilya twisted. Her weapon flashed. Her energized whip stabbed into Sun's shoulder and upper chest. Blood sprayed. Sun staggered backward. His aura flared violently, then flickered. The rooftop suddenly fell silent. Blake froze. Ilya did too. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was serious, far more serious than anyone intended. For a split second, Blake saw conflict in Ilya's eyes. Then the chameleon faunus turned and fled. Disappearing across the rooftops, Blake started after her. One step, two. Then she heard Sun collapse behind her. Immediately she turned. The chase no longer mattered. Sun sat against a rooftop chimney, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers. His aura struggled to compensate for the injury. Despite the pain, he managed a weak grin. You know, he winced. I really thought this was going to be easier. Blake dropped beside him. For a moment, guilt threatened to overwhelm her. Once again, someone had been hurt helping her. Once again, someone had paid the price. But this time, she pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for guilt later. Right now, Sun needed help. Together, they slowly rose with Blake supporting most of his weight. As they made their way back toward the Belladonna estate, Blake glanced down at the scroll she still carried. The scroll Ilya had desperately tried to protect. Whatever was on it, it mattered. And as the sun began to set over Menagerie, Blake had the distinct feeling that she had just taken the first real step toward uncovering whatever the White Fang was planning next. And perhaps toward stopping it. Chapter 9. Pieces in motion. Salem sat at the head of the table unmoving. Around it sat her lieutenants awaiting instructions. Arthur Watts sat attentively, hands folded in front of him, posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than respect. "Oh, joy! I see Cinder is recovering," he said lightly. A pause, then with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I see the grim arm is functional. One could even say elegant in its brutality." Across the chamber, Cinderfall did not respond. She could not afford to. Watts tilted his head slightly. "I would advise caution, of course. Emotional instability tends to interfere with performance." The implication was deliberate. Cinder's jaw tightened beneath her restraint. Salem raised a single hand. The room quieted further. Watts stopped speaking. Then the air shifted as something new arrived. A floating shape drifted into the chamber. A living lens of grim construct. The seer, several in the room instinctively leaned away, but Tyrion Callows leaned forward instead, almost delighted. Watts did not move, but he studied it like a scientific curiosity. Salem's voice was calm. "This will accompany you to Haven and Professor Lionheart." Watts inclined his head. "A surveillance instrument and a message," Salem corrected, and something more than either of those things remained unspoken. Watts accepted it without protest. Watts then watched as the seer contracted itself, and he placed it in his satchel. Salem spoke to them again. Haven was the focus. The next phase had begun. Assignments followed, precise, measured, inevitable. The pieces were already moving in a different chamber. One that was warmer in tone, but no less dangerous. Another meeting was taking place. The White Fang Leadership Hall, where Sienna Khan sat on her throne as the organization's high leader. Opposite her stood Adam Taurus, and behind him, silent but observant, stood Hazel Reynard. Hazel spoke first. He told Sienna that Haven was vulnerable, that Salem required action, and that time was short. No ideology, no rhetoric, just utility. Sienna did not hesitate. No. One word. Absolute. The room tightened. Adam exhaled slowly. Not anger, decision. His hand moved. The blade came free, fast, clean, final. Sienna Khan fell without ceremony. No speech followed. No resistance mattered. Only silence. Hazel closed his eyes briefly. When he spoke, it was not triumph, it was regret. Nobody had to die today. Adam looked down at the body. Then at Hazel. I disagree. Chapter 10. The roads converge. The morning sun hung low over the rolling hills of Anima, casting long shadows across the road as Ruby's group continued their journey eastward. Weeks of travel had begun to show. Their clothes bore the dust of countless miles, boots were worn, and supplies had been replenished and exhausted more than once. Yet, despite the hardships, there was a growing sense among them that their destination was finally within reach. Ahead, a patrol that included a huntsman appeared along the road. Crow narrowed his eyes. Well, that's new. The patrol moved with practiced discipline, their banners displaying the crest of Mistral. Ruby felt a wave of relief. Actual authorities, actual civilization, actual people who weren't trying to kill them. The lead officer raised a hand. Halt, state your business. After a brief exchange and verification of licenses, huntress credentials, and identification, the tension eased considerably. The officer's expression shifted from suspicion to surprise. You've come all the way from Vale, mostly on foot, Jean replied. The officer winced. That's dedication. Well, after the fall of Beacon, there wasn't much choice on where to go. Nora added cheerfully. The patrol leader nodded before turning serious. Haven Academy has been expecting huntsmen and huntresses displaced by the fall. I'll radio ahead. He stepped away and spoke into a communications device. Several minutes later, he returned. You've got transportation coming. Ruby blinked. Transportation. The distant hum of engines answered for him. Everyone looked skyward. 2 Mistral military airships emerged over the hills. Ren actually smiled. Nora practically bounced in place. We get to fly. The officer nodded. The kingdom would prefer trained huntsmen to arrive rested rather than exhausted. Crow smirked. That's the smartest thing I've heard all month. But remember, these are still nearly first-year students. As the airships descended toward a nearby clearing, Ruby felt something she had not experienced since Beacon. Hope. For the first time in weeks, Haven Academy felt real. Not simply a destination, a place, the next step. Far to the north, in Atlas, Weiss Schnee stared through the porthole window of a cargo vessel as the kingdom disappeared behind her. The ship smelled of machinery, dust, and old metal. It was a far cry from the luxurious airships she had spent her life aboard, and that suited her perfectly. The memory of the previous evening remained fresh. The pilot had been exactly the sort of man her father would have hired for nefarious work. Unshaven, greedy, practical, most importantly, willing to bend the law. The Atlas dust embargo had created opportunities for smugglers willing to take risks. After enough lien changed hands, questions became remarkably unimportant. The pilot had merely shrugged. Try to stay out of sight. I don't ask questions. Weiss had agreed immediately. Now she sat alone among secured dust containers as the vessel cut through the clouds toward Anima. The journey ahead remained uncertain. For the first time since Beacon, however, the uncertainty belonged to her, not her father, not Atlas, not the Schnee name, her. A small smile touched her face, then vanished as turbulence rattled the hull. The pilot's voice echoed faintly from above. Weather's turning ugly, Weiss sighed. Perhaps freedom had its disadvantages. Still, she would gladly face storms over another day trapped in the Schnee Manor. Thousands of miles away, the sea stretched endlessly beneath a cloudless sky. A ship sliced through the waves toward Anima, and along the rail stood Yang Xiaolong. Wind tugged at her golden hair. Salt air filled her lungs, and for a long while she simply stood there watching the horizon, watching the future. Her new arm rested comfortably at her side. Weeks earlier, she could barely bring herself to look at it. Now it moved naturally, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but naturally. The memory of sparring with Taeyang surfaced, his lessons, his encouragement, his understanding, most of all his willingness to let her make her own choices. Her hand flexed. Metal fingers responded instantly. Yang glanced down at them, then back toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond it lay Anima and Mistral. Somewhere beyond that lay answers. About Raven, about Ruby, about Beacon, about everything that had changed. The ocean wind carried her thoughts away. For now, movement was enough. She was no longer standing still. At Haven Academy, Professor Lionheart's office remained quiet. Too quiet. The headmaster sat behind his desk, attempting to focus on paperwork that had ceased holding his attention hours ago. A knock sounded, his stomach tightened. He already knew who it was. Enter. The door opened. Dr. Arthur Watts stepped inside as though he owned the building, which, Lionheart reflected bitterly. Perhaps he effectively did. The scientist crossed the room without invitation and dropped comfortably into a chair. Moments later, he helped himself to a cup of tea from Lionheart's own service tray. Lionheart watched in silence. Watts took a leisurely sip. Excellent tea. The headmaster said nothing. Watts appeared completely unbothered. In fact, he seemed remarkably relaxed, as though discussing the downfall of kingdoms was no more stressful than discussing the weather. Watts then opened his satchel, and the seer grim expanded and floated quietly to a shadowed corner of the room. Its presence made Lionheart's hair stand on end. Watts, meanwhile, propped his feet onto the edge of a nearby table. The gesture was so casual it bordered on insulting. Another sip of tea, a satisfied sigh, then a smile. Not warm, not friendly. Predatory. Watts looked across the room at the increasingly uncomfortable headmaster. Salem always said you were. He paused thoughtfully, hospitable. The teacup clicked softly against its saucer. Lionheart felt a chill crawl down his spine, and outside the office windows Haven Academy stood peaceful beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, however, the first cracks had already begun to spread, and neither the students nor the kingdom beyond had any idea how close they were to breaking. Chapter 11. Old Souls. The towering spires of Haven Academy rose above the city of Mistral, gleaming in the afternoon sun. For Ruby, the sight inspired relief. For Crow, it inspired caution. For Belgariad, it inspired questions. The group followed Professor Lionheart through the Academy's halls, their footsteps echoing through corridors that felt strangely empty. Ruby glanced around. "Where is everybody?" Lionheart smiled politely. "We're currently between semesters. Most students have already returned home, and many of Haven's faculty have been assisting the kingdom with grim suppression efforts following the fall of Beacon." The explanation sounded reasonable enough, yet the Academy still felt wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still, as if something was missing. Lionheart led them into his office and motioned toward several chairs. "Please, sit." The group settled in. Crow remained standing. The headmaster folded his hands together. "I must say, it is a relief to finally see all of you safely arrived." "Wasn't exactly a pleasant trip," Crow replied. Lionheart nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure." His gaze drifted toward the three strangers seated among the group. Garion, Silk, Belgariad. Something in his expression tightened, only for a moment, then it vanished. Belgariad noticed. The old sorcerer leaned comfortably in his chair. "So," he said casually, "how long have you been running this academy?" Lionheart blinked. "Several years. And before that, I taught here." Belgariad nodded as if satisfied. He wasn't. The headmaster's answers were quick, too quick. Each response felt rehearsed, as though he wanted the conversation to move along as quickly as possible. Belgariad filed the observation away. For now, Crow stepped forward. There is something else. Lionheart's attention shifted immediately. What is it? I spoke with Raven. The room grew noticeably quieter. Lionheart remained perfectly still. Crow continued. She didn't tell me anything directly, but I got the impression she knows something about the Spring Maiden. A flicker of relief crossed Lionheart's face, gone almost instantly. Belgariad saw it. Nobody else did. I was thinking about putting together a scouting party, Crow continued. Find her tribe, see what they know. Lionheart shook his head immediately. I would advise caution. Crow frowned. Caution, the Branwen tribe is dangerous. If they truly know something about the Spring Maiden, charging in recklessly could jeopardize valuable information. Crow didn't look convinced. I wasn't planning on charging anywhere. Even so, Lionheart said. Perhaps we should gather additional intelligence before taking action. The answer sounded reasonable. Too reasonable, Crow grunted. We'll talk about it later. Lionheart visibly relaxed again. Belgariad noticed that too. The remainder of the meeting passed without incident. Eventually, everyone stood, and RWBY and the others headed for the door. Crow lingered. Everyone head back to the house. Get settled in. What about you? RWBY asked. Crow smirked. I'm going to get a drink. Belgariad immediately rose from his chair. Excellent idea. RWBY laughed. Of course, Silk stood as well. I think I'll spend some time getting acquainted with the city. Try not to rob anyone, Garion said. Silk looked offended. I am wounded by the accusation. Then he smiled. At least publicly, the tavern was dimly lit and pleasantly noisy, exactly the sort of place Crow preferred. Belgariad seemed equally comfortable. Several empty mugs already occupied their table. The old sorcerer lifted another. I must say, your world's beer isn't entirely terrible. Crow chuckled. That's practically a compliment. It was. The tavern door opened, and a young farm boy stepped inside. He hesitated, his eyes scanned the room before settling on Crow. Then he walked directly toward their table. Belgariad watched with interest. The boy looked nervous, very nervous, yet determined. He stopped beside the table. I don't think they let kids in here, Pipsqueak, Crow said. The boy blinked, then appeared to be talking to someone who wasn't there. Shut up, I'm getting there. Both Crow and Belgariad looked at each other. Then the farm boy nodded awkwardly, then cleared his throat. Well, my name is Oscar Pine, and I'm supposed to tell you I'd like my cane back. Belgariad's eyebrows rose. Crow began nodding his head, then reached beside his chair and produced a simple cane. He handed it to the boy, who accepted it carefully. It's good to see ya again, Oz, Crow replied. Oscar held it tightly for a moment. Then Belgariad noticed something. The boy's posture changed. His nervousness disappeared and his expression settled. Then his eyes opened again, older eyes this time, not physically, but spiritually older. Belgariad had seen enough strange things over the centuries to recognize when another mind was looking out through familiar features. The newcomer smiled. It is good to see you again, Crow. Crow nodded. Belgariad leaned forward immediately. Well now, Ozpin turned toward him. The old wizard studied him carefully. So you're living inside the boy, or at least in his head? Ozpin chuckled softly. I suppose that is one way to describe it, and this arrangement occurs every time you die? It does. Belgariad stared for several moments, then took a drink. That sounds exhausting. To his surprise, Ozpin laughed. Most days it certainly feels that way. Crow rolled his eyes. The two oldest men in the room immediately launched into questions, with neither seemingly being inclined to stop. Garion would have found it amusing. Silk would have found it profitable. Ozpin answered only a handful. Yes, he had lived for an extraordinarily long time. No, he was no longer entirely human, or rather what remains from his original existence are his memories, personality, and part of his power. And yes, every life eventually merged with the next, a curse given to him by the gods for a failure in his past. Belgariad found the process fascinating, disturbing, but fascinating. Eventually he leaned back in his chair. Ozpin raised an eyebrow. I've met a great many unusual people. Belgarath took another drink. You may be the first man I've met who makes me feel young. For the first time in years, Crow laughed hard enough to nearly spill his drink. Even Ozpin smiled. Outside, evening settled over Mistral. Within Haven Academy, secrets continued to grow. And somewhere in the city, Professor Lionheart sat alone in his office, hoping desperately that none of his visitors had noticed how nervous he truly was. He was wrong. One of them had Chapter 12, Crossroads. Far above the waters of Lake Matsu, a lone cargo vessel cut through the morning sky. Weiss Schnee sat atop a stack of secured cargo crates near the rear of the ship, staring through an open maintenance hatch at the vast expanse of water below. The journey had been uneventful, which suited her perfectly. The pilot had spent most of the trip in the cockpit, occasionally shouting weather updates over the roar of the engines while otherwise leaving her alone. Weiss preferred it that way. For the first time since leaving Atlas, she had time to think. No father, no servants, no bodyguards, no expectations, only the road ahead. A sudden alarm shattered the silence. The pilot's voice echoed from the cockpit. Grim. Weiss was on her feet instantly. Several dark shapes emerged from the clouds ahead. Lancers, a swarm of them. The pilot swore loudly. The first Grim slammed into the hull. Metal screeched. The entire vessel lurched violently. Weiss was already moving. Mertenaster flashed into her hand. A glyph appeared beneath her feet. She used it to anchor herself to the ship's hull. The battle began. Ice shards exploded through the air. Dust rounds tore through Grim wings. One Lancer spiraled downward into the lake below before dissolving. Then another and another. The pilot watched through the cockpit window in disbelief. A fourth Grim dissolved into fragments. Weiss stood gracefully on the deck, with the outer door open. Then a deafening shriek rolled across the sky. A Queen Lancer. The Grim towered over the cargo vessel. Its wings stretched impossibly wide. Its armored body glistened black in the sunlight. The pilot's face turned white. Oh no, the Queen charged. The ship shook violently as Weiss threw herself aside. Its massive stinger punched through the deck where she had been standing moments earlier. Weiss attacked immediately. Ice, fire, lightning. Nothing worked. The creature barely slowed. The Queen surged forward again. Projectile stingers clipped one of the engines. Metal exploded outward. The cargo vessel immediately began listing to one side. Warning alarms blared. The pilot fought desperately to maintain altitude. We're losing an engine. Weiss gritted her teeth. Conventional attacks weren't enough. She knew it. There was only one option left. Taking a deep breath, she planted Mertenaster into the deck. A massive glyph spread outward. White light surged around her. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Slowly, a massive armored figure emerged from the glowing symbols. The armor Gigas, it filled the entire cargo bay of the ship. The pilot simply stared. What in the world? Weiss pointed toward the Queen, and the spectral knight obeyed. The battle that followed looked like something from a myth. The armor Gigas launched itself into the sky. Its enormous blade met the Queen in midair. Shockwaves rolled across the lake. The Grim shrieked. The knight struck again and again. Finally, with one tremendous overhead slash, the Queen Lancer split apart, and then it dissolved over Lake Matsu. For a brief moment, Weiss smiled, then the crippled engine finally failed. The cargo vessel dropped. Fast, very fast. The pilot shouted something. Weiss never heard what it was. The world became spinning metal, broken cargo, screaming alarms, a crash. Then darkness. Hours later, Weiss groaned. Everything hurt. Her eyes slowly opened. Trees, sky, broken wreckage. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the crash returned to her. A shadow fell across her face. Two rough-looking men stood over her bandits. One grinned. Well, look at this. The other laughed. Think she's worth anything? A third voice answered. Oh, she's worth quite a bit. The bandits immediately stepped aside. A woman approached, long black hair, red clothing accented with black. A grim mask hung at her side. Sharp crimson eyes studied Weiss carefully. The woman smiled, not warmly, calculatingly. Well, she crouched beside Weiss. Looks like we hit the jackpot. Weiss's eyes widened. Then Raven Branwen's boot connected squarely with her jaw. Darkness claimed her once more. The Just Right station was a welcome sight on a road where there were few oases outside of kingdoms. A combination gas station, convenience store and bar sitting alone beside a dusty road. The sort of place Yang was surprised to see surviving in the wilderness. Yang stepped inside and approached the counter. Before she could speak, a drunken voice called out behind her. "Well now," Yang sighed. Of course, a seedy-looking man stumbled from a nearby table, clearly intoxicated, clearly making poor decisions. He swaggered forward. "You're a long way from home, sweetheart." Yang ignored him. The bartender winced. The drunk reached for her glorious hair. Big mistake. Yang moved instantly. She turned to face him as her eyes turned from violet to red. His expression changed immediately, then Yang punched him. The man flew across the room and right out the front door. Silence filled the station. Yang smiled pleasantly. "Sorry." The bartender slowly handed her a bottle of water. "This one's on the house." Yang drained it in seconds, then leaned against the counter. "I'm, looking for someone. Someone named Raven Branwen." The bartender froze. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several patrons suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The bartender glanced nervously toward the windows. "People don't usually ask about Raven." "I'm not most people." The bartender sighed. "Word is, her camp is somewhere in the forests east of here." "Thank you." She turned toward the door. Outside, the man she'd punched was slowly pulling himself out of the dirt. He paused as he overheard the conversation. His eyes narrowed. "I hear you're looking for Raven." Yang stopped. "Maybe." The man spat blood onto the road, then grinned. "I can take you to her." The trip took a little less than 2 hours, and the sun was still high enough it sat above the trees. Yang's motorcycle rolled slowly along a narrow forest trail. The bandit got off the bike and said he would check up ahead to make sure the coast was clear, then disappeared into the trees. Yang sighed. "Really?" Moments later he returned, along with half a dozen armed bandits. She wasn't surprised. The bandit grinned. "Hand over your bike." Yang rolled her eyes. "Of course, that's not going to happen." The fight lasted less than a minute. Tai Yang's lessons echoed through her mind. Stay calm. Think. Don't rush. The bandits attacked. Yang dismantled them easily, one by one. A punch, a throw, a sweep, a counter. When it ended, 6 bruised men and a couple of women lay scattered across the forest floor. Yang brushed dirt from her jacket, then turned toward her motorcycle. Behind her, the original bandit struggled to his feet. "It doesn't matter," Has said, spitting blood from his mouth. Yang paused. "When Raven finds out you're dead." Yang glanced over her shoulder. A small smile appeared. "Possibly." The bandit smirked. Then Yang added, "I'm her daughter, after all." The smile vanished. The man's eyes widened. Fear replaced arrogance instantly. "I'm dead," was all he said. The forest opened. The sun was setting when they finally reached the camp. Yang stepped forward, followed by several of the now bruised and battered bandits. In front of her was an entire settlement. Watchtowers, tents, campfires, dozens of people moving throughout the camp. The Branwen tribe. For years she had searched, wondered, imagined. Now she was finally here. Somewhere within that camp waited Raven Branwen, and Yang suddenly realized she wasn't entirely sure what she was going to say when she found her. The wind rustled through the trees, the campfires flickered, and as darkness slowly settled over the valley, Yang stared down at the place that held the answers she had spent half her life chasing. Chapter 13. Revelations. The rented house in Mistral had never been particularly quiet. Between Nora's boundless energy, Ruby's enthusiasm, and the constant flow of travelers coming and going, Silence was a rare commodity. Today, however, was something else entirely. Oscar Pine stood near the center of the room, with his shoulders slightly hunched and his hands clasped nervously in front of him. Everyone was staring. Everyone. "Wait? You're saying Ozpin's alive?" Ruby asked. "How does that work?" Jean added. "Does he live in your head?" Nora blurted out. "Can you hear him right now? Does he sleep? Do you sleep?" Oscar opened his mouth. Nothing came out. A second question immediately replaced the first, then another, then three more. The poor farm boy looked as though he desperately wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Finally, Ruby rubbed the back of her neck and let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, this is really weird." Oscar nodded immediately. "Yes." His shoulders sagged slightly. "It is." Crow finally stepped forward. All right. He waved everyone back. "Give the kid some space. This is very disconcerting for everyone." Oscar glanced toward him gratefully. The room slowly settled. Even Nora managed to restrain herself. Across the room, Belgariad sat comfortably in a chair, one eyebrow raised and his eyes glittering with amusement. Crow looked toward Oscar. "Ready to show everyone your little parlor trick?" Oscar let out a resigned sigh, then nodded. "Just know I'll still be here." The room grew silent as Oscar closed his eyes. For several moments, nothing happened. Then his posture changed. His shoulders straightened, and the nervous uncertainty vanished. When his eyes opened again, they carried a calm wisdom that did not belong to a farm boy. Ruby's breath caught. Joan stared. Pyrrha's eyes widened. Ozpin smiled softly. "It is good to see all of you again." The room erupted. "What? No way. It really is him. That's impossible." Several voices began speaking at once. Ozpin waited patiently until the excitement died down. Eventually, silence returned. His expression grew more solemn. "I owe all of you an apology." Nobody spoke. "I failed Beacon." His gaze lowered. "I failed my students." Ren finally broke the silence. "It wasn't your fault." Ozpin closed his eyes briefly. A sad smile crossed his face. "Yes, it was." The room fell still. Ozpin looked up again. "I once told some of you that I have made more mistakes than any man, woman, or child on this planet." His voice softened. "I was not exaggerating." Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Ozpin took a slow breath. "I'm cursed." The word seemed to hang in the air. "For thousands of years I have lived, died, and returned." Ruby blinked. Jean looked stunned. Pyrrha sat frozen. Each word seemed impossible. "Whenever I die, my soul merges with that of a like-minded soul. My memories remain, but I am changed." Ozpin gestured slightly toward himself. "Eventually we become one." He smiled faintly. "Oscar is simply the latest. It began after my first death." His eyes grew distant. "A bargain I made with the gods. A chance to stand against Salem." The room remained silent. "For thousands of years I have fought her." His expression hardened. "And for thousands of years I have failed." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of those words settled heavily upon the room. Finally, Belgariad leaned forward. His eyes never left Ozpin. "If you fought her that long and never won." The old sorcerer's voice was calm. "Why do you believe you can win now?" The question lingered as Ozpin did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the flue, then toward the window, then back to Belgariad. Finally he spoke. "I don't know." The honesty surprised everyone, even Belgariad. Ozpin folded his hands behind his back. "I do know one thing." His expression darkened. "Salem cannot be killed." The room went silent again. Crow stared into his glass. Ruby's eyes widened. Jean looked utterly confused. Ozpin continued. "She is immortal. Whenever her body is destroyed, she returns. If she is wounded, she recovers. There is no weapon that can permanently end her." The implications were horrifying. Belgariad sat quietly, thoughtful, measuring, calculating. Finally he spoke again. "Then what are we fighting for?" Ozpin looked toward him. For the first time there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. The answer may lie within the relic of knowledge. Several heads turned. Crow nodded grimly. Ozpin continued. It is hidden beneath Haven Academy. The relic is sealed inside a vault that can only be opened by the Spring Maiden. RWBY immediately sat forward. The Spring Maiden. Crow grunted. And I think Raven knows where she is. Ozpin nodded slowly. Then that is where our path leads. His expression became serious once more. We must obtain the relic, and then take it to Atlas. RWBY frowned. Why Atlas? Ozpin was silent for several moments. Then he answered, because when the time comes, everyone will need to know the truth. The room grew quiet once more. No one fully understood, but everyone understood enough. The relic, the Spring Maiden, Atlas. Those were the next steps, whether they were ready or not. Far from Mistral, far from Haven. Yang Xiaolong stood in the center of the Branwen tribe's camp. Bandits surrounded her on all sides. Some watched curiously, others watched warily. All of them knew exactly who stood before them, the daughter of Raven Branwen. Then, two figures emerged from Raven's tent. The first was a short-haired woman with a tattoo of a strange bird on her arm. The second was unmistakable, red and black clothing, a grim mask covering her face. Yang barely noticed Vernal. Her entire focus rested on one person. For years she had searched. For years she had wondered. For years she had imagined this moment. Finally, she spoke. Mum. Raven stopped. Slowly she reached up. The grim mask came away. Sharp crimson eyes studied Yang carefully. For a moment neither spoke. Then Raven smiled faintly. Yang, it appears you finally found me. Yang remained silent. Raven continued. Your determination brought you here. Your strength, your persistence, well done. But did you have batter my men to find me? Yang's expression hardened. That's not why I'm here. Raven blinked. The smile vanished. What? Yang folded her arms. I'm not here for you. Several nearby bandits exchanged glances. Raven's eyes narrowed slightly. Yang continued. RWBY is in Mistral, or on her way there. I need you to help me reach her. Raven stared. And why should I do that? Yang didn't hesitate. Because we're family. She pointed directly at Raven. And Dad told me how your semblance works. That got Raven's attention. You create bonds. Then you can open portals to the people connected to them. Yang stepped forward. You have one for Dad, one for me, and one for Crow. Raven remained silent. Yang's voice sharpened. Crow promised he'd look after RWBY. So make a portal to him, and I'll be out of your hair. The camp had become completely silent. Raven studied her daughter for several long moments. Finally, she spoke. It's noble that you want to help your sister. Her voice became colder. But if she's following your uncle? A faint sneer crossed her face. She's already a lost cause. Yang's temper flared immediately. I don't care what you think. Several bandits took a few steps forward. Just send me to Crow, damn it. For a long moment, Raven simply stared. Then she sighed. A look of disappointment crossed her face. Very well, she turned away. If that's what you think, then we're done here, she gestured dismissively. Take her away. One of the bandits immediately rushed forward. That proved to be a mistake. Yang's eyes flashed red. Her mechanical fist connected with his jaw. The unfortunate bandit flew backward. Straight through a nearby tent, canvas exploded outward, wood shattered. Everyone froze. For a brief moment there was silence. Then a familiar voice called out, Yang. Yang blinked. Her head snapped toward the destroyed tent. On the other side sat a battered cage, and inside that cage sat Weiss Schnee. Yang stared. Weiss stared right back. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Weiss rolled her eyes. Well, she sighed, I guess subtlety is out. A brilliant glyph appeared beneath her feet. White light exploded across the camp. Bandits stumbled backward. A gigantic spectral armored knight materialized inside the cage and shattered the roof upward. Weiss and the RWBY broke out of the collapsing cage. Yang's eyes widened. What is that? The camp instantly erupted. Weapons appeared. Bandits shouted. Several began moving forward. Weiss grabbed Myrtenaster from a stunned Vernal's hands as she passed, then planted herself beside Yang. Back to back. Ready. The RWBY towered above them. Wary bandits surrounded them from every direction. For one dangerous moment it looked as though the entire camp was about to descend into chaos. Then lightning crashed from the sky. The thunder shook the valley. Everyone froze, heads turned. Vernal stood with one hand raised. Enough! The single word echoed across the camp. Then silence. Even the bandits stopped moving. Raven sighed heavily, as though the entire situation had become exhausting. She looked toward Yang, then Weiss, then the RWBY. Finally, she shook her head. If you're truly determined to go to your sister... Her voice softened slightly. Then it's time you learned what you're really fighting. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into her large central tent. Yang watched her go, then slowly turned toward Weiss. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Weiss threw her arms around her. Yang froze, then hugged her back. I missed you too, Ice Queen. Weiss laughed, despite herself, and for the first time in months, two members of Team RWBY stood together once again. Chapter 14. Reunion. The interior of Raven's tent is surprisingly quiet. The sounds of the camp outside are muffled by the heavy canvas walls. A lantern hangs from the center pole, casting a warm orange glow over a table cluttered with maps, half-empty bottles, and scattered papers. Yang stands with her arms crossed, with Weiss standing beside her, Myrtenaster resting at her hip. Across from them, Raven sits comfortably in a chair, as if the confrontation outside had never happened. For several moments, nobody speaks then. Weiss breaks the silence. So this is where you've been hiding? Raven raises an eyebrow.
Hiding.
You abandoned your family, your team, and a huntsman legacy to become the leader of a bandit tribe. Weiss gestures toward the tent walls. And most importantly, you abandoned your own daughter. Raven simply sips her tea as Yang takes it all in and looks with intense focus at her mother, her eyes shifting between violet and a fiery red. From there, the conversation continues with small jabs and defensive remarks. Neither Weiss nor Yang are particularly interested in making peace. Raven, meanwhile, seems content to let their frustrations bounce harmlessly off her. Eventually, Raven's expression grows more serious. There are things you both need to know. The mood immediately changes. Yang sighs. Here we go. Raven ignores the comment. Ozpin isn't who you think he is. Both girls look up. Raven continues. The man has spent centuries collecting secrets, manipulating people, sending others to fight battles he never fully explains. Weiss frowns. He helped train huntsmen. He founded Beacon. Raven's eyes narrow. And how much do you actually know about him? Neither girl answers. Raven rises from her chair. You think you're fighting a war against monsters. You aren't. Her voice becomes quieter. You're fighting a war against a woman who controls them. Yang and Weiss exchange a glance as Raven continues, the grim answer to her, and she cannot be killed. Silence fills the tent. Weiss is the first to speak. What do you mean she can't be killed, and who is she? I mean exactly what I said, Raven replied. Yang studies her mother carefully. For once, Raven does not appear sarcastic, nor does she look dismissive or superior. She simply looks tired, very tired. The realization unsettles Yang more than the words themselves. Weiss folds her arms. If that's true, then why are we fighting her at all? Raven gives a bitter smile. A very good question. The answer hangs unspoken. For a moment, the tent falls silent again, then Yang shrugs. It doesn't matter. Raven blinks. Yang straightens. Maybe Ozpin has secrets. Maybe Salem can't die. Maybe everybody's lying to everybody. But Ruby's still out there, as she points toward the tent flap, which means I'm still going to find her. Weiss nods. Yang fixes Raven with a stare. So, are you going to help us or not? Raven studies her daughter. A long moment passes, then another. Finally, she exhales, a tired sigh. Come on. She leads them outside. The camp grows quiet as Raven walks past. Bandits move aside, and Vernal watches from a distance. Eventually, Raven leads them behind the main tent. The air shimmers as a portal tears open. They cannot see what is beyond it. Moments later, Bumblebee rolls forward, and Weiss adjusts her travel suitcase. The two girls prepare to leave, and Raven speaks. Yang. Yang pauses. She looks back. For a brief moment, Raven looks almost uncertain, something Yang has never seen before. I may not be so kind the next time we meet. The response comes instantly from Yang. You weren't kind this time. The words hit harder than a shout ever could. Raven flinches almost imperceptibly. Yang turns away as she and Weiss ride through the portal. The opening begins to shrink, and the portal closes. Raven remains standing there, looking at the empty space where her daughter vanished. For several moments she says nothing. Then, quietly enough that only Vernal might hear, I know. Evening had settled over Mistral. The city lights twinkled below, while Haven Academy sat illuminated in the distance atop its mountain perch. Crow Branwen leaned against the wooden railing of the guest house's second-floor balcony, and for once he wasn't drinking. He simply stared toward Haven, towards the academy, towards the battle he knew was coming. The sounds of laughter drifted from inside the house behind him. Nora was probably terrorizing someone again. A faint smile touched his lips, then the air behind him rippled. He froze. A familiar sensation ran down his spine, and he quickly turned. A crimson portal split open in the air. His first thought was immediate. Raven. The portal expanded, and a motorcycle rolled through. Crow blinked as Yang emerged with Weiss behind her. Then Crow's eyes widened a bit more, and he simply said, Oh. The guest house was unusually lively that evening. In the kitchen, Ruby, Nora, and Ren stood around an enormous kettle of ramen bubbling atop the stove. Nora was trying to convince everyone that one gigantic batch was not enough, but they ignored her. Whether that was actually true remained debatable. What do you mean it's not done yet? Nora demanded. Ren peered into the kettle. I mean it's not done yet. Well, make it done, Nora whined as her ever-present hunger made her surly. That's not how cooking works. Ruby laughed as the two continued bickering. For the first time in weeks, things almost felt normal. Then Crow's voice echoed from the living room. Ruby. She glanced toward the doorway. Come out here for a second. I'm helping cook. You're helping Nora terrorize dinner. Crow responded. Nora pointed a spoon at him. I heard that. Crow ignored her. Just come here. Ruby shrugged. Don't burn the ramen. Ren looked at her. You realize you're telling the wrong person that? Ruby grinned and hurried from the kitchen. The moment she stepped into the living room, she froze. Everyone was looking toward the center of the room. Standing there were two figures, Yang and Weiss. Ruby's breath caught, and for a moment the world simply stopped. Yang smiled softly. Hey, Rubes! Ruby didn't move. She couldn't. Weeks of fear, weeks of uncertainty, weeks of wondering if she'd ever see them again. All of it crashed into her at once. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Yang remained silent. Ruby took a shaky step forward. I shouldn't have left. The words came tumbling out. I should have stayed. I should have helped you. I should have. Her voice broke. Tears spilled freely now. Yang's expression softened even more. Ruby shook her head. I just left. The guilt she'd carried since Beacon finally spilled out. Yang crossed the room. Without hesitation, she wrapped Ruby in a hug. Ruby immediately buried her face against her shoulder. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Yang quietly said, I love you. Ruby froze. The words hit harder than anything else. Ruby hugged her back just as tightly. I love you too, she sobbed. Across the room, Weiss quietly wiped at the corner of one eye. Nobody commented. Nobody needed to. Then Yang looked over Ruby's shoulder and slowly opened one arm. Ruby followed her gaze and opened her arm as well. Vice. The single word carried everything: relief, joy, friendship. Home. Weiss blinked rapidly, then abandoned all attempts at maintaining dignity and rushed forward. A moment later, all three girls were locked in one enormous embrace. Nobody in the room dared interrupt, not even Nora. For several precious moments, Team RWBY was together again. Almost only Blake remained absent, but for the first time since Beacon, being whole again felt possible. Much later, everyone sat crowded around the dining table. Bowls of ramen filled every available space. Conversations overlapped constantly. Questions flew from every direction. Yang and Weiss spent nearly as much time answering as eating. Eventually, the discussion shifted to Ozpin and Beacon. Oscar repeated everything he had explained earlier for Yang and Weiss's benefit. His connection to Ozpin, the reincarnation, the curse, the long war against Salem, the relics. The room gradually grew quieter. Then Nora casually mentioned something else. And then we found out crow can turn into a bird. Yang nearly dropped her chopsticks. What? Crow immediately sighed. Oh, for you can turn into a bird? Yang stared. Nora pointed. And Raven too. Yang slowly turned toward Oscar. How could you do that? The room instantly tensed. Oscar visibly shrank, but before he could answer, Crow cut in sharply. Enough. Everyone looked toward him. Crow's expression was unusually serious. We both wanted it. Yang blinked. You what? It was our choice. The tension lingered, then Oscar closed his eyes. A familiar calm settled over him. When he opened them again, Ozpin looked back. It was entirely voluntary. His voice remained calm. Both Crow and Raven accepted that responsibility willingly. Yang remained silent and Ozpin continued. I offered them a gift, the ability to see more and do more, and a faster means of travel. I needed information on Salem's activities, and this provided them a means to scout in places that might be dangerous even for a huntsman. He looked directly at her. I never forced either of them. Yang's anger gradually faded, but confusion remained. Ozpin folded his hands around his cane. Crow chose to continue walking beside me and working towards this goal. A shadow crossed his face. Raven, however, eventually chose another path. The room grew quiet. Ozpin let the statement settle. Then he shifted the discussion. We have more immediate concerns. Everyone's attention focused on him. The relic of knowledge remains beneath Haven Academy. We require the Spring Maiden to open the vault. Yang immediately thought of Vernal. The image of the woman calling down lightning flashed through her mind. Ozpin continued, somehow we must convince Raven and the Maiden to cooperate. Silence followed. The task sounded nearly impossible. Eventually Ozpin finished outlining the situation as the room sat quietly. Finally, Yang stood. Everyone looked toward her. She folded her arms. If everybody agrees... She paused and looked directly at RWBY. Then so do I. Then Yang's expression hardened, but no more lies. The room went still. Yang looked directly at Ozpin. No more half-truths, no more secrets. The challenge hung in the air, and Ozpin considered it carefully, and he especially glanced at Belgariad, sitting across the room, looking at him intently. Finally, he nodded, agreed. The single word carried weight, because for perhaps the first time in a very long time, trust was beginning to be rebuilt. Chapter 15. The bargain. Several days had passed since Yang and Weiss disappeared through Raven's portal, and life within the Branwen camp had gradually returned to normal, or at least as normal as a camp full of bandits could manage. At the front gate, a familiar bandit lounged against the wooden barricade. His jaw had finally stopped hurting. Mostly, it had been a very bad week. He sat with several other guards near the gate when movement on the road caught his eye. 4 figures approached, 2 young, 2 older. The bandit squinted. The boy carried himself with casual confidence, while the green-eyed girl beside him looked equally unimpressed by the world. Mercury Black and Emerald Sustri. Neither slowed as they reached the gate. We're here to see Raven Branwen, the bandit snorted. Yeah. He cracked his knuckles. You know, I've had a really bad week. The bandit's eye twitched, and I think maybe it's time I took it out on somebody. Emerald sighed, and Mercury smirked. Then two more figures emerged from the road behind them. The bandit's bravado immediately evaporated. A woman with short black hair and with a patch over one eye walked next to a sharply dressed man, carrying himself with effortless confidence. Dr. Arthur Watts. The bandit swallowed. Cinder Fall stepped forward. A small flame appeared above her palm, dancing lazily. The fire reflected in the bandit's widening eyes. Still feeling aggressive, the gate immediately swung open.
Nope.
Mercury laughed. The four entered the camp. Their arrival caused immediate unrest as bandits stopped what they were doing and conversations died on the spot. Weapons shifted subtly closer to hands as everyone recognized danger when it walked into camp. Inside Raven's tent, Vernal burst through the entrance. "They've found us." Raven looked up from her chair. For several moments she said nothing, then she exhaled slowly. "Of course they have." Vernal frowned. "What do we do?" Raven stood. "We've prepared for this." She reached for her grim mask. "I'll be out in a moment." Going outside, Vernal stepped onto the platform before Raven's tent. The camp had already formed a loose circle around the newcomers. Mercury and Emerald stood casually. Watts appeared thoroughly entertained, and Cinder looked impatient. Then Raven emerged, her grim mask concealing her face. The camp immediately fell silent, but hands settled on weapon hilts. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Raven broke the silence. "I don't remember inviting so many people into our home." A slight smile touched Cinder's lips. "Be nice." She spread her hands. "We're here with a bargain." Raven's posture remained unchanged. "And what exactly does Salem have to offer me that I can't get for myself?" Cinder's smile vanished. "Your life." Her eyes narrowed. "The lives of everyone here." Several bandits shifted nervously. The temperature itself seemed to drop. Raven took a step forward. Danger radiated from her, but before either woman could continue, Watts smoothly stepped between them. "Ladies." He adjusted his jacket. "Let's not immediately start threatening one another." His gaze shifted to Raven. "Salem wants only one thing, the relic." He spread his hands. "Once she has it, your tribe ceases to matter." Raven studied him. "How can I trust her?" Her gaze swept over the group. "Better yet, how can I trust any of you?" She pointed toward Emerald and Mercury, two children, then toward Cinder, a fall maiden so intoxicated with power she can't stop displaying it. Finally, she looked at Watts and a disgraced Atlesian scientist. Mercury coughed to hide a laugh. Cinder's eyes briefly flashed. Watts merely smiled. "Excellent assessment." He adjusted his glasses. "Though technically I was also a doctor," Watts continued. "Trust isn't required, only cooperation." Silence followed, then Cinder stepped forward before anything else. Her gaze sharpened. "Prove the Spring Maiden is here." The camp grew still. Raven turned toward Vernal, a small nod. Vernal stepped forward, closed her eyes and raised her hands. The wind immediately began to howl. Clouds gathered overhead. Lightning flickered across the darkening sky. Several bandits took nervous steps backward. The display continued for several moments. Then Raven raised a hand. "Enough." The storm faded. Cinder's expression softened slightly. Satisfied, exactly as Raven intended. Raven folded her arms. "Agreements like this are built on trust." Her voice echoed across the camp. "And frankly, I don't trust any of you." Watts opened his mouth. "You are hardly in a position to—" Cinder silenced him with a raised hand. "What do you want?" Raven was quiet, long enough for tension to build. Finally she answered. "I want assurances." Cinder waited, and Raven's masked gaze settled on her. "My brother." The camp went silent. Even Watts looked surprised. Cinder blinked. "Crow?" Raven nodded. "He's currently in Mistral, working with several students." She paused. "And 3 very unusual outsiders." Watts immediately became interested. Raven continued, "If I put myself and the maiden at risk, if I help secure the relic, then I want guarantees." Her voice hardened. "I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder waiting for Crow Branwen to come after me." The statement lingered. Perhaps it was truth. Perhaps it was not. Only Raven knew. Cinder considered it, then slowly extended her hand. "We have a deal." For several moments Raven stared at the offered hand. Then she reached forward. The two women shook. Neither trusted the other. Neither intended to honor the spirit of the agreement, but for now, the bargain had been made. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. The Belladonna estate was unusually quiet that morning. Inside the foyer, Gira Belladonna paced back and forth with a folded sheet of paper in one hand. Several versions of the speech already littered a nearby table. None of them felt right. Callie sat comfortably nearby, while Blake leaned against the wall and Sun occupied a chair opposite Blake's mother. Gira stopped pacing. "What if they don't believe me?" Blake immediately answered. "They will." Finally, he straightened. "Well," he folded the speech. No sense delaying. Together they stepped outside. Most of Kuokwana had gathered with Faunus, filling the streets surrounding the Belladonna estate. Workers, shopkeepers, families, journalists, even some older veterans of the White Fang. People waited expectantly. Gira climbed onto the platform and the crowd gradually quieted. He looked out across the sea of faces, then began. He spoke of Beacon. He spoke of Adam Taurus. He spoke of the attack, of civilians killed, of students murdered. He especially spoke of the White Fang's cooperation with Cinder Fall. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Disbelief, shock, anger. Then Gira revealed what had been recovered from Ilya's scroll. Evidence, plans, communications. The crowd grew quieter still. Then came the revelation. "Sienna Khan is in danger." The statement drew immediate reactions. Many Faunus exchanged concerned looks, while others flatly refused to believe it. Gira pressed on. He explained Adam's ambitions, his lust for power, and even his willingness to murder his own people. Finally, he arrived at the most important point. Haven Academy. The crowd listened. The White Fang intends to attack Haven. A hush fell over the square. Gira looked across the gathered citizens. "If this happens, if the White Fang attacks another Huntsman Academy," his voice hardened, "the world will not distinguish between Adam Taurus and the Faunus people." That struck home. Many faces darkened. Others looked away. Gira raised his voice. "We have one choice. We must go to Haven Academy and defend it at all costs." Silence followed. Long silence. No one moved. No one volunteered. The hesitation hung heavily over the gathering. Then a voice called out from the crowd, "Hypocrites!" Heads turned and a figure stepped forward. A grim mask concealed her face. Blake immediately recognized her. "Ilya!" The crowd shifted uneasily. Ilya pointed toward the Belladonnas. "You speak of unity. You speak of peace. But every time humans hurt us, you speak of forgiveness." Her voice rose. "You ask us to sacrifice. You ask us to trust the same people who spent generations treating us like animals." Several people nodded reluctantly. Others remained silent. Ilya continued. "You care more about what humans think of us than what happens to your own kind." The accusation hit hard, then Sun stepped forward. "That's enough." Ilya immediately backed away. Sun lunged, but she was already moving. Blake moved too, yet within moments Ilya vanished into the crowd. No one attempted to stop her, no one pointed after her, no one helped. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Several hours later at the Albane residence, a recording played across a monitor. Adam Taurus stared back from the screen. His red blade rested across his shoulder. "I've received confirmation." His voice remained calm. "Blake Belladonna is on Menagerie." The room remained silent. "The Belladonnas continue to bring me nothing but pain." His gaze hardened. "I want you to capture Blake Belladonna, but not before you slaughter her family." A pause. "I have a promise to keep." The screen flickered, and the recording ended. Corsac and Fennec Albane stood quietly. Neither appeared surprised. A knock sounded at the door. "Enter." Ilya stepped inside. "You called for me?" The brothers exchanged a glance, then began speaking almost as one. "The situation has become complicated. Adam has issued new instructions." Ilya listened. Her expression gradually shifted: confusion, concern, then alarm. "Assassination," the brothers nodded. "A necessary sacrifice, wouldn't you agree, Sister Ilya?" Ilya looked away. The words clearly unsettled her. Finally she nodded, but there was no conviction in it. As she left the room, neither Albane brother noticed, and for the first time Ilya's loyalty was beginning to crack. Chapter 17. Choices. The evening air was warm and humid as Blake Belladonna stood alone on the second-floor deck overlooking the Belladonna estate. The lights of Cuoquana glowed in the distance beneath the twilight sky. For a few precious moments, everything seemed peaceful. Blake, son's voice drifted from inside the house. "You ready to go?" Blake smiled faintly. The two of them had spent nearly every day since Gira's speech speaking with citizens throughout Menagerie. Progress had been slow, but it had been progress. Just a minute, as she turned toward the door, something caught her eye. A folded note had been tucked into the railing beside her. Her smile faded. Carefully, she pulled it free and unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Ilya." Blake's eyes moved quickly across the page. "I don't know what to do anymore. Please come alone. I need to talk to someone who understands." A location was written at the bottom. Blake stared at it for several moments, then folded the note. Her expression hardened. "1 minute," she repeated quietly. The alley was dimly lit. Only a handful of lanterns illuminated the narrow passage between buildings as Blake approached cautiously. She saw Ilya immediately. The chameleon Faunus stood alone, unarmed, waiting. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ilya spoke. "I'm sorry." Blake relaxed slightly. "I know you're scared." Ilya looked away. "My father can protect you." Still, Ilya didn't respond. Blake took another step forward. "You don't have to do this anymore." Ilya slowly shook her head. "No." She looked back at Blake. There was sadness in her eyes. "I'm sorry." Blake frowned. "You can make it up by." Ilya's face hardened. "No, I'm sorry." Before Blake could react, Ilya raised one hand. That was the signal. Two figures dropped from the rooftops. A bat-winged Faunus crashed into Blake from above. A second Faunus with spider-like traits swept her legs out from under her. Blake hit the ground hard. Before she could recover, her weapon was ripped from her grasp, and a web which shot out of the spider Faunus's hand cocooned her in a trap. She stared in shock. "Ilya, why?" Pain crossed Ilya's face. "We have to do what's right for the Faunus." Blake's eyes widened in both shock and fear. "And you're in the way. You can't do this." The words came out almost desperate. "Killing me won't change anything." Ilya's expression somehow grew sadder. "No." She shook her head. "That's why you're going to Mistral." Blake froze. To Adam. Silence. Then Ilya quietly took off towards the Belladonna residence. Blake's heart stopped. The two White Fang members tightened their grip. "Come on now." For one terrifying moment, Blake simply stared. Then she shouted, "Now!" A golden blur exploded from the rooftop. Sun Wukong crashed into the bat Faunus like a missile. The White Fang operative flew halfway down the alley. The second barely had time to react before Sun's staff smashed into her stomach. She hit the ground. Hard Sun tossed Gambol's shroud back to Blake. "Glad you decided to invite me." Blake caught her weapon. "You heard, Ilya? We have to go." The two sprinted toward the Belladonna estate. The battle had already begun. The front entrance of the Belladonna home lay in ruins as White Fang members flooded through the shattered doors. Gira Belladonna stood at the center of the foyer. A pair of loyal guards fought beside him. Across from them stood Corsac and Fennec Albane. Several White Fang soldiers closed in. One of Gira's guards fired. Corsac's weapon flashed. The bolt struck the guard directly in the chest. He collapsed, dead before he hit the floor, Something inside Gira snapped. His eyes widened and lowly he removed the ceremonial robes of the chieftain. The garments fell to the floor. For a brief moment, everyone stared, then claws extended from his fingers. The massive panther Faunus lowered himself into a fighting stance. A growl rumbled from deep within his chest. Not a man, not a politician, a predator. The White Fang hesitated. Gira charged. Elsewhere in the house, Callie Belladonna crouched behind an overturned table, a guard firing repeatedly from beside her. Shots struck walls, and furniture exploded into splinters. White Fang members continued advancing. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. Then the front wall exploded inward with Sun bursting through in a shower of debris. His staff struck one White Fang member, then another. Gira followed seconds later. Together they forced the attackers backward. Across the foyer, the Albane brothers regrouped. Then a shadow dropped from above. Blake landed directly in front of them. The brothers immediately attacked. Blake's shadow clone formed itself in ice. Their weapons suddenly trapped in the frozen image. Gira glanced toward his daughter. "Go," Blake turned. "Go see to your mother." She sprinted toward the adjoining room. Ilya stood waiting, balanced atop a second-floor railing. Electric energy crackled along her whip. The moment she saw Blake, she set herself into a battle stance. For several seconds, neither moved. Then each attacked. The battle was fast and ferocious. Blake's shadow clones burst apart in smoke and ice. Ilya's whip lashed through the room. Walls shattered, furniture splintered. Neither could gain the advantage. Finally, Blake managed to close the distance. Gamble's shroud hooked around Ilya's weapon, one violent pull. The whip flew from her hands and Blake tackled her. Both crashed to the floor. Blake pinned her down, breathing hard. "This isn't the way," Blake pleaded. Ilya struggled. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." Ilya stopped. For a moment she couldn't answer. Blake's voice softened. "Is this what your parents would have wanted?" The words struck like a physical blow. Ilya froze. The fight vanished from her eyes. Her voice cracked. "I don't know what to do." Silence. Tears began forming, then more quietly. "I don't know what to do." The wall exploded inward, and the Albane brothers charged into the room. Gira and Sun followed close behind. Corsac managed to drive his blade into Gira's shoulder, and the massive Faunus roared. Sun immediately slammed Corsac against a support pillar. Wood cracked. The pillar shattered. The entire second-story balcony collapsed. Corsac disappeared beneath the wreckage. Fennec screamed in rage and charged directly at Sun. Suddenly, he stopped as electricity erupted across his body. Ilya stood behind him, whip extended. Fennec convulsed, then collapsed, unconscious. The room fell silent. Ilya dropped her weapon, tears streaming down her face. Hours later, the fighting was over. The surviving White Fang members had been arrested. Medical teams treated the wounded, and citizens crowded around the Belladonna estate. Many had seen what had happened, and now everyone had heard what had happened. Blake stood atop the front steps, looking out across the gathering. For a moment she said nothing. Then she spoke. "This wasn't done by humans." The crowd quieted. "We did this." She gestured toward the damaged estate. "Faunus," her voice grew stronger. "We can be just as violent as the humans are, but I don't think we like to hear this." Blake paused for a moment, closing her eyes before continuing on. "This is what will happen to Haven if we do nothing and let Adam and the White Fang destroy it." Silence. Every eye remained fixed on her. Blake took a breath. "So I'm going." Her voice carried across the crowd. "And if I have to go alone, I'll go." Heads turned. Ilya stepped forward. Her eyes were red, but determined. "I'll go if you want me." More silence. Then another voice. "I'll go." And another. "I will too." A dock worker stepped forward. Then another. "And me." A merchant. A fisherman. One by one they began stepping forward. The crowd's uncertainty finally broke, and momentum spread through the gathering. Volunteers emerged from every direction. Gira watched it happen, pride shining in his eyes. Finally he stepped forward. We have approximately 2 weeks. The crowd quieted. We'll need training. He pointed toward several craftsmen. We'll need shields. Then toward the harbor and transportation. Blake smiled slightly. I think I know a ship captain who owes me a favor. Laughter rippled through the crowd. For the first time in days, hope felt real. Gira looked at his daughter, then at the citizens of Menagerie, then at the growing crowd of volunteers. The battle for Haven had not yet begun, but at last, Menagerie had chosen its side. Chapter 18, Into the Snare. The moon hung high above Mistral, and a solitary raven descended from the darkness where it landed upon the roof of Haven Academy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bird dissolved into a swirl of black feathers, and where the bird had been now stood Raven Branwen. She adjusted her mask and glanced toward the academy. The place was quiet, too quiet. Without a word, she made her way through the darkened halls, eventually arriving outside a familiar office. A nervous voice answered her knock. "Come in." Raven opened the door only to have Professor Leonardo Lionheart nearly jump out of his chair. His eyes widened. Raven," she shut the door behind her. The lion faunus looked around nervously as though expecting someone else to appear. Raven simply crossed her arms. "I see you finally decided to go against Ozpin." Lionheart swallowed. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do." Raven moved further into the room. "You know," Raven said quietly, "for a man helping orchestrate the downfall of a huntsman academy, you look remarkably uncomfortable." Lionheart clenched his jaw. "You don't understand?" "No." Raven leaned forward. "Then explain it." Silence. Then finally Lionheart spoke. "She can't be beaten." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Nobody can stop her." Raven studied him and thought at least that answer was honest. Perhaps the first honest thing he'd said in a long while. "I had the pleasure of meeting with Cinder and Watts recently. We agreed on a plan, which I'm sure you agreed to." Lionheart nodded. "So everything is ready." Raven pushed as Lionheart nodded again. "And Crow?" Raven asked. "He suspects nothing," Leo replied wearily. Raven raised an eyebrow beneath her mask. That alone told her how terrified the man truly was, because if Lionheart actually believed Crow suspected nothing, he was a fool, and fools rarely survived long. "What exactly happens tomorrow night?" Raven demanded of him. Lionheart hesitated, then slowly explained. The meeting, the ambush, and the forces waiting nearby. And at the last he told her about the vault, about the relic. Raven listened carefully, interrupting only occasionally. When Lionheart finally finished, Raven was silent for several moments. Then she turned toward the door. "One final question." Lionheart stiffened. Raven glanced back over her shoulder. "If everything falls apart." The words hung in the air.
"What's your plan?"
The professor stared. His mouth opened, then closed. No answer came. Raven almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she simply opened the door. "That's what I thought." The door shut behind her, leaving Lionheart alone, and somehow even more frightened than before. In a rented house overlooking Haven Academy, a fire crackled softly in the parlor. Most of the group occupied other rooms throughout the house. For once, the noise and energy of Team RWBY and Team Juniper were absent. Only a handful of figures sat around the room. Belgariad, Silk, Garion, Crow, and Oscar. The conversation had been quiet and thoughtful, the sort that preceded battles. Oscar sat with Ozpin, occupying the forefront. The older soul's presence was obvious in his posture, his voice, and especially his eyes. "We still know very little." Ozpin frowned. "And that concerns me." Crow took a drink. "You're worried about Lionheart?" Ozpin nodded. "Yes and no," said Ozpin. "I've known Leo for many years." "And?" the question came from Silk. Ozpin sighed. "And he has never once behaved like this." Nobody spoke. That alone said enough. The ringing of a scroll interrupted the discussion. Crow glanced down. It was Lionheart. Everyone immediately noticed. Crow answered and put it on speaker. "Leo." A nervous voice emerged from the device. Crow, there was a pause, then Lionheart continued. I've made some progress. Crow exchanged a glance with Belgariad. What kind of progress? The council, another pause. I think we're finally ready to move forward. Belgariad's eyes narrowed, and Crow remained expressionless. Lionheart continued. It would be best if all of you come to Haven tomorrow night to explain and hash out the details. Crow listened, then nodded. We'll be there. The call ended. Silence settled over the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds, until finally Ozpin broke it. Crow looked toward him. Ozpin folded his hands. That doesn't sound like what Lionheart told you before. No. Crow took another drink. It doesn't. Belgariad grunted. It has all the makings of a trap. Silk immediately nodded. An obvious one. Garion remained quiet, listening, watching. Ozpin leaned back. I agree, Crow sighed. Then the question becomes whether we walk into it. Belgariad snorted. We're going. Crow looked toward him. You sound certain. The old sorcerer shrugged. If it is a trap, then sooner or later they'll spring it. His gaze drifted toward the window overlooking Haven. At least this way we know where. Nobody immediately disagreed, because everyone understood the truth. If Salem's people were moving, if Lionheart was compromised, if the relic truly lay beneath Haven, then there was no avoiding the confrontation, only choosing when and where it should happen. Ozpin finally nodded. Then we proceed. Crow rubbed his face. We tell the others in the morning. Silk smirked. I imagine they'll be thrilled. That earned a small laugh from Garion. Even Belgariad's beard twitched, and for a brief moment the tension eased. The moment was brief, however, because outside their window Haven Academy stood illuminated beneath the moonlight, waiting, and somewhere within its walls the trap was already closing. Chapter 19. The Trap Springs twilight settled over Haven Academy. Long shadows stretched across the courtyard as a group of huntsmen, huntresses, and travelers crossed the stone pathway toward the main hall. No one spoke much, and something felt wrong. Not danger exactly, something deeper. A feeling as though everyone had arrived at the same conclusion, but no one wished to say it aloud. RWBY walked beside Yang, with Jean and Pyrrha following close behind. Ren and Nora quietly scanned their surroundings, while Oscar walked near Crow. Belgariad, Silk, and Garion brought up the rear. Ahead of them loomed the main academy building. The large doors opened with a groan, and the group stepped inside. The hall appeared empty until a voice echoed down from above. Welcome. Everyone looked upward. Professor Leonardo Lionheart stood upon a second-floor balcony overlooking the hall. He looked terrible, nervous, sweating. His hands gripped the railing tightly. He cleared his throat. There appears to be more of you than before. Crow smirked.
Well, you know.
He spread his arms. The more the merrier. A few chuckles broke the tension. Only Lionheart didn't laugh. His eyes darted among them. Then he asked, Why did you bring your weapons? Several people exchanged confused looks. Crow blinked. Leo, we're huntsmen. His brow furrowed. What exactly did you think we'd bring? Lionheart said nothing as Yang's attention drifted upward. Something had caught her eye. And there, perched upon the corner of the balcony railing, sat a raven. Its eyes glowed crimson and Yang froze. Mum. The raven launched itself from the railing as black feathers swirled through the air. The bird then transformed behind Lionheart. A moment later, Raven Branwen stood there, arms folded, with a grim mask concealing her face. Crow's expression darkened. Raven, a faint snort escaped her. The Branwen twins stared at one another, years of history hanging between them. Then Raven began descending the staircase. You've been scheming, little brother. Crow's eyes narrowed. You have the Spring Maiden. Raven stopped halfway down the stairs. I do, then hand her over. His voice hardened. And let's work together. Raven actually laughed. Not kindly. You still don't understand? She continued descending. There is no beating Salem. The room fell silent as Raven stepped onto the floor. Only a few yards separated the opposing sides now. Without warning, she drew her blade, and as the weapon flashed, a portal erupted beside her. From within, a fireball burst through, and Ruby barely had time to react. The explosion struck her squarely in the chest. She cried out and crashed backward across the floor. Then the portal widened. Figures emerged: Cinderfall, Emerald Sustrai, Mercury Black, Vernal. They moved to stand beside Raven. Cinder smirked. Well, her eyes swept across the room. This is disappointing. Her gaze settled on Ruby. I expected more. Yang immediately helped Ruby to her feet, and as she did, the academy doors suddenly burst open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. Hazel stepped inside. He glanced toward Cinder, the white fang setting the charges. Then his gaze shifted to the huntsman. No one's getting in, and back towards the doors. And no one's getting out. Silence. The two groups stared at one another. A final moment before violence. Then Raven spoke. Vernal. The young woman stepped forward. Take out the heiress. Raven's eyes narrowed. But don't use your power. Vernal nodded. Raven immediately lunged, her sword crashing against Harbinger as Crow met the attack. Steel rang through the hall, and the battle began. The academy erupted into chaos. Mercury immediately charged Yang, their weapons colliding. Neither needed introductions. The memory of the vital tournament still lingered. Miss me? Mercury grinned. Yang growled and answered him with a punch. Emerald vanished into the melee. Pyrrha and Jaune moved to intercept her, but the illusionist thief danced backward, always just beyond reach. A flicker of her semblance clouded Pyrrha's vision. For a moment, Pyrrha hesitated as the battlefield shifted. A memory beacon tower. Penny, blood. Pyrrha stumbled, and Emerald smiled. Jaune immediately stepped between them, breaking the illusion. Pyrrha! Pyrrha shook her head and refocused, and then she charged ahead. Hazel drove a dust crystal directly into his arm. Electricity surged across his body. Another crystal followed. Fire erupted around his fists. Ren, Nora, and Silk scattered as the floor exploded where Hazel struck. Silk cursed. Unlike everyone else present, he possessed no aura. One mistake, one glancing hit, and he was dead, which meant he would need to do what Silk always did best: cheat. Oscar slipped away, almost unnoticed. Up the staircase, toward Lionheart. The professor saw him approaching, and as was his nature, fear immediately crossed his face. Then he saw that unmistakable cane, Ozpin. Ozpin's voice echoed quietly within the boy's mind. "What happened to you, Leo?" Leonardo Lionheart said aloud. "You can't have had this form for long. You're not really him. If I can take you to her, she'll have to let me go." Then a bit of hope sprang into his eyes. "Then I can finally be free." He activated his weapon and faced Oscar head-on. Cinder floated above the battlefield. Fire swirled around her. Pure maiden power. Raw destruction. Ruby and Garion moved together. Ruby's speed and Garion's sword. Neither could get close. Explosions forced them back again and again, while the orb pulsed softly beneath Garion's shirt, waiting, calling. But Garion refused. The memory of Cuchic's fortress, and the devastation wrought when his grandfather and the disciple of Torak had their magical fight, lingered in his mind. A battle so great it ripped the side of a mountain off. Garion knew what unleashed sorcery on that level could do. One careless mistake, and Haven itself might collapse around them. So he held back, for now. Belgarath stood near the edge of the battle, watching, measuring. A gesture and a word redirected debris away from Nora. Another sent a burst of force that pushed Hazel back. But his primary attention remained fixed upon Garion. Across the room, Vernal relentlessly pressured Weiss. Every attempt she made to summon ended the same way. Interrupted, broken, countered, Weiss fought desperately. Glyphs, dust, rapier thrusts, nothing worked. Vernal stayed inside her guard, never allowing her the concentration she needed. Then a hard strike landed when her guard was down. Weiss's aura shattered. The familiar burst of light erupted around her, then vanished. Weiss collapsed, breathing hard. Defenseless, Cinder noticed immediately, her eyes shifting toward the fallen Schnee heiress. Then she smiled. Not strategically, not tactically, cruelly, a spear of glass formed within her hand. Ruby saw it. No, Cinder threw. The spear crossed the room in an instant. It struck Weiss directly through the chest, with the impact hard enough to lift her from the ground. For a brief moment she remained suspended, then fell to the ground. Cinder's conjured spear dissipating into thin air. Then Weiss hit the floor and remained motionless. Mercury stopped. Yang froze. Pyrrha stared. Joan's face went pale. Even Hazel looked toward the fallen girl. Across the room, Belgariad stood utterly still as the world seemed to stop. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Weiss Schnee lay motionless upon the floor. And for a moment, the battle was forgotten. Chapter 20, Live. Silence hung over the battlefield as Weiss Schnee lay motionless upon the floor. The remains of Cinder's glass spear dissipated after doing its damage. For one terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Jean broke first. Weiss! He screamed and sprinted across the hall. Ruby and Belgariad were right behind him. Around them, the battle slowly lurched back into motion. Mercury lunged toward Yang. Hazel renewed his assault against Ren, Nora, and Silk and Emerald vanished into another illusion. Steel crashed against steel as Raven and Crow resumed their duel. The battle had not stopped, only paused, pausing long enough for everyone to understand what had happened, long enough to realize Weiss was dying, or already dead. Jean dropped to his knees beside her. No. His hands hovered over her chest. He reached for his semblance, reached for her aura. Nothing. The familiar sensation never came. There was no aura left to touch, no spark left to amplify. His hands trembled, and once again he tried. And again, nothing happened. Ruby looked at him desperately. Jean. The young huntsman stared at Weiss, then lowered his head. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Ruby's eyes widened. Jean swallowed hard. "She's gone." The words struck like a physical blow. Ruby's knees buckled. "No." A tear rolled down her cheek. "No." Another followed. "No, no, no." Her voice cracked. The grief poured out of her. She reached for Weiss's hand, as though refusing to let go, as though refusing to accept it. Then Belgariad stood. Something had settled inside him. A certainty. A decision. Belgariad saw it immediately, and his eyes widened. No, Belgariad didn't hear him. Or perhaps he did, and chose to ignore him. Belgariad pushed through the chaos toward him. "Belgariad." The old sorcerer's voice was sharp, urgent. "Don't." Belgariad knelt beside Weiss, his hands moving towards her wound. Belgariad felt genuine fear. "Belgariad!" Too late, the young sorcerer had already begun. Stopping now could be worse. Far worse. Ruby looked up through tears. What is he doing? Belgariad stared at his grandson. His expression had become unreadable. He's trying to bring her back. Ruby blinked back. Belgariad's voice lowered. He's using sorcery. Belgariad barely heard them. His entire focus had narrowed to a single purpose. Weiss. The world around him faded. The battle, the shouting, the crashing weapons, all of it disappeared. Only Weiss remained. Only Weiss and the memory of a cave not too long ago, of a stillborn colt and Siedra's tearful request, of horse, of the impossible thing he had once done. He reached inward, gathering his will, drawing upon every ounce of strength he possessed. And the now familiar wall appeared, the barrier that separated life from death. The boundary no mortal was meant to cross, and one even the gods of his world feared to cross. Belgariad pushed against it anyway, searching, reaching, trying to find Weiss beyond it, and for a moment he did. But she was far away, farther than Horse had ever been. Horse had existed for minutes, but Weiss had lived for 16 years. Her essence lay beyond his grasp, beyond his power, beyond anything he could reach. His teeth clenched. Sweat poured down his face. No, not yet. Not this time. His hand moved inside his tunic. The orb emerged. Ancient, perfect, terrible. A thing beyond the gods, but also a thing of his own universe itself. Belgariad inhaled sharply as Garion laid it upon Weiss's chest. Power surged, the wall trembled. Garion reached again. Farther, deeper, beyond what any mortal should ever attempt. Jorn watched helplessly. RWBY cried quietly beside him. Garion's voice came through gritted teeth. "Jana!" The young huntsman looked up. "If I succeed," his body shook. "Be ready." The orb glowed and the pressure intensified. Garion felt his strength slipping away. His vision blurred, and still he pushed. Still he reached. Still he searched. And at last he found her, a faint spark. Distant, almost beyond reach. Garion seized it, and the effort nearly broke him. Every instinct screamed at him to stop. Every ounce of strength burned away. His lungs felt like fire. His muscles trembled. Then he spoke. Just one word, one command, one act of will live. The hall seemed to shudder. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Weiss's chest rose violently. Air rushed into her lungs as her entire body jerked and her eyes fluttered open. Jean reacted instantly. His aura surged. Golden light flowed from him into Weiss. The wound began closing, broken flesh knitting together, life returning. RWBY stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. Weiss. The heiress and her best friend blinked weakly, confused, disoriented, alive. RWBY laughed and cried at the same time, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. She leaned towards Weiss, but Belgariad's hand settled gently on her shoulder. "Give her a moment." RWBY nodded, unable to speak. Garion fell backward as exhaustion hit him like a hammer. The orb slipped from his fingers, and his entire body felt empty, as though he had poured everything he possessed into a single impossible act. Belgariad looked down at him, then toward Weiss. Breathing, alive. The old sorcerer often claimed that nothing was truly impossible. But he also understood limitations. Yet here Weiss Schnee lay, alive. And for perhaps the first time in many years, Belgariad found himself at a loss for words. Above them, Cinder smiled. She had long since stopped paying attention. Whether the girl lived or died, what did it matter? The relic was what mattered. Power was what mattered. She called toward Raven. "Get the maiden." Raven nodded. Neither woman spared another glance toward the battle below as Vernal quickly joined them. Together they crossed the upper level. Lionheart sat hidden behind a pillar. Terrified, Cinder stopped before him. "Open the vault." The headmaster swallowed, then obeyed. The elevator platform descended down, and down, and down. Ancient machinery groaned around them. The deeper they traveled, the quieter it became. Cinder folded her arms. Her eyes settled on Vernal and a smile touched her lips. "You know," Vernal ignored her. Cinder continued anyway. "It must be quite an honor." Silence. The first maiden in who knows how long to open a vault. Vernal finally glanced toward her. "I don't care." Her voice remained flat. "I'm doing this for my tribe." Cinder chuckled. Of course she was. Everyone always told themselves a story, a reason, an excuse. Anything to avoid admitting they wanted power. Cinder's gaze shifted toward Raven. "You've taught her well." Raven remained silent. The elevator continued downward, toward destiny. Outside Haven Academy, the final explosives were being positioned. White Fang soldiers moved throughout the grounds, and Adam Taurus stood among them, directing the assault. "Tonight," he declared, "Haven falls." Several White Fang members cheered. Others nodded grimly. Then a voice called out, "Adam." He turned. Blake Belladonna stood atop a nearby rooftop, alone. Adam smiled. "What do you know?" He folded his arms. "I go through all that trouble trying to capture you, and you bring yourself to me." Blake looked down at him, calm, steady. "This isn't what's best for the Faunus." Adam laughed. "Do you think you can stop me?" Blake considered the question, then answered honestly, "No." Adam's smile widened, then Blake finished, "Not by myself." A second figure appeared. Sun Wukong coming from his right, with dozens of faunus behind him, all carrying shields and weapons. Sun grinned. That's because she didn't come alone. Adam's expression faltered. What? How? Then another voice spoke. With your brothers and sisters, Gira Belladonna emerged from the opposite side of the courtyard, with more faunus following him. Several White Fang members visibly hesitated. Some recognized faces, some recognized family. Weapons slowly lowered as Adam looked around in panic. The certainty he had carried began to crack. Blake jumped down and stepped forward. It's over. Adam stared at her, then reached into his coat. A dead man's switch emerged. His smile returned. He pressed the trigger. Then it's over for all of us. Click. Nothing happened. Adam frowned. Click. Nothing. Click. Still nothing. Huh? Blake smiled faintly. We sent someone to check on your explosives. Adam's eyes narrowed. Blake continued. And when she found them, she disarmed them. High above upon Haven's second-story exterior, Ilya Amitola emerged from the shadows. Her skin shifted from dark camouflage back to its natural colors. A bundle of severed wires hung from one hand. Adam stared speechless. Blake looked at him one final time. I told you, it's over. Around him, White Fang members began dropping their weapons one after another. The sound echoed across the courtyard. Adam's face twisted with rage. No! Then he charged. Blake calmly stood there in front of him as Adam's blade swept toward her. Blake vanished, a shadow clone shattered beneath the strike. And before Adam could recover, Blake appeared beside him. Both hands clasped together, she brought them down hard, and Adam crashed across the courtyard, where he rolled to a stop. The world around him had already moved on. His army was gone, his bombs were gone, his advantage was gone. Adam slowly rose and looked around once. Then he fled into the darkness. Sun began to go after him, but Blake held him back. He's getting away, Sun cried out. We can't beat him, Blake replied. He wants to draw us out and pick us off one by one. In a flash, Adam was gone, the night and forest swallowing him whole. And as the battle for Haven raged on within the academy, the war for the soul of the White Fang had finally came to an end. Chapter 21, Reunion and Decisions. Deep beneath Haven Academy, the platform finally came to a stop. Before them stood the great vault door, 20 feet tall and covered in intricate carvings of folded oriental fans that interlocked across its surface. Cinder smiled. So this is it. Beside her, Vernal remained silent. Raven stood a short distance away with her arms folded, and the tension between them felt almost physical. Cinder turned toward Vernal. Go ahead. Vernal frowned. What? Open it. Cinder's smile widened. Place your hand on the door. The Spring Maiden alone can open the vault. Vernal slowly raised her hand while behind them Raven watched, waiting. Cinder never looked back. Instead, she spoke while studying the vault. You know, they say you're strong. She glanced sideways at Raven. And cunning. Raven's eyes narrowed. Her hand drifted toward Omen's hilt. Still, Cinder did not turn. Too bad they're wrong. Ice exploded outward. In an instant, Raven found herself encased in a prison of solid frost. Vernal jerked backward. What? The grim arm struck. Cinder's clawed fingers punched directly into her abdomen. Vernal screamed. The black claws dug deep. Blood splashed across the stone floor. The maiden decoy collapsed to one knee as the grim arm withdrew. Cinder approached slowly, almost lovingly. You had a power that you never deserved. Vernal coughed blood and Cinder crouched before her. But I do. Her remaining eye gleamed. And I'm taking what's mine. Behind her came a crack. Then another. The ice prison surrounding Raven began to splinter. Neither woman noticed. Cinder reached toward Vernal, waiting, expecting, ready to feel the maiden power pass into her. Vernal gasped, and her body slumped, and her eyes dimmed. Cinder waited, but nothing happened. Her smile vanished. A moment later she experienced confusion as her eye widened. Where? She looked down at her grim arm. Where's the power? Then the ice encasing Raven exploded outward as she stepped free. Her expression was murderous. "You won't find it." Cinder spun around as Raven reached up and tore away her grim mask, red eyes blazing. "Because Vernal isn't the Spring Maiden." Raven drew omen. "I am far above the vault of the Spring Maiden." The battle still raged. While outside Haven Academy, the last remnants of the White Fang were being rounded up by Mistral authorities and Menagerie volunteers. Blake was standing beside Sun as officers secured prisoners when suddenly a crash was heard and a body exploded through Haven's front doors. Hazel rolled across the courtyard. Blake stared. "What in the world?" But before Hazel could orient himself, a massive, ethereal stinger shot through the doorway and pierced straight through his torso and yanked him back into the academy. Sun blinked. What was that? The answer appeared moments later. Weiss Schnee could be seen through the shattered entrance, and behind her towered a magnificent spectral queen lancer, larger than any summon she had ever created. Its wings spread wide, its stinger still glowing. Blake froze. Weiss, inside the hall, the battle was reaching its conclusion. Ruby stood near the center while everyone looked exhausted. Then Ruby too noticed. Blake. Blake's eyes widened. Ruby. At the same moment, Yang turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Then, shaking them out of their reverie, Ruby pointed toward the vault platform. "Yang!" Yang turned. "Go!" She followed Ruby's gesture. The platform. The vault. The relic. Yang nodded, then looked back one last time. Then she jumped onto the descending platform and vanished below. For perhaps the first time since in many years, Cinder Fall did not look confident, and her arrogance fell away. But she quickly recovered, and the cynical mask appeared once again. "Vernal was the decoy this entire time," she said. "I'll bet the last Spring Maiden must have trusted you a great deal." Raven said nothing, her eyes blazing red with the purple outlines of the maiden power. Then she pulled her sword and rushed towards Cinder. Cinder simply smiled and manifested 2 glass weapons from her semblance. And the fight commenced. Steel met nearly unbreakable glass, bolstered by aura. Magic collided with magic, and the chamber erupted. Fire swept across the stone floor. Raven answered with torrents of ice that shattered into glittering shards. Wind screamed through the cavern, and columns cracked beneath invisible pressure. Cinder launched herself into the air on wings of flame, while Raven met her head-on using the wind. Their swords clashed again and again, every collision detonated like thunder. Fire became lightning, lightning became frozen spears, spears shattered beneath blasts of molten glass. The ceiling groaned, entire stalactites tore free and crashed into the battlefield. Neither woman yielded an inch, as minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Both were breathing hard. Aura shimmered, then cracked, then shattered. The familiar sound to both echoed through the chamber. Cinder stumbled backward, her aura gone. Across from her Raven lowered omen, as her aura too was spent. Raven's breathing steadied, and she stood with her hands on her hips. "Had enough," Cinder panted. "Shut up." Then Raven smiled. "You'd be stronger," she said, looking beyond Cinder, "if you'd learn to watch your back." Cinder frowned then, with wide eyes turned as Vernal raised herself up to use the last remaining strength in her broken body. Bang! Cinder raised her arms to protect her face from Vernal's weapon, and Raven used that moment to strike. She flew in with an open palm full of maiden magic to smash into Cinder's face with tremendous force. Cinder flew backwards and completely off the ledge. Her eye patch disintegrated as she tumbled into the endless abyss below. She opened her mouth, but no scream emerged. Raven looked down without expression, then calmly extended one hand. Ice blossomed through the air, and crystal engulfed Cinder's falling body. Encased in frozen silence, she disappeared into the darkness below. The chamber became still as Raven slowly lowered her hand. She turned to see Vernal lying motionless. Raven knelt beside her. For several long moments, she simply looked at the woman who had willingly carried the burden of a lie for years. Finally, she reached out and closed Vernal's eyes. "Thank you, Vernal." She stood and walked toward the great vault doors, placing her hand upon the ancient stone. One by one, the curved fans folded inward, and the massive door slowly opened. Beyond them lay another world, a sunlit desert stretching to the horizon, and floating serenely at its center, the lamp of knowledge. Raven took one step forward, then stopped as behind her a sound of something crashing hit the floor. Yang had arrived. Raven turned with outrage at the intrusion and watched as Yang calmly closed the distance between herself and the woman she had searched for, and had only just encountered a few days before, nearly since childbirth. Mother and daughter, and a final reckoning. Raven broke the silence. "I knew you'd survive." Yang said nothing. Raven continued, "You're my daughter after all." Yang still said nothing. Then she stepped closer, glancing down at Vernal. The last spring maiden. Raven's expression shifted. "What about her?" Yang studied her carefully. "She must have trusted you a great deal." Silence. Yang continued, "So tell me, did she die in battle?" No answer. Was she sick? Nothing. Then realization struck. Yang's eyes widened. "How could you?" Raven's face hardened. "She was scared when we found her. She wasn't cut out for this power, and she would have been hunted all her life." Yang looked at her and said, "So was it survival? It was mercy." Raven raged. Silence followed once again. Then Yang spoke softly. "You may be strong." Raven glared. "But you're not brave." Raven looked genuinely outraged. "Who do you think you are?" Standing there, shaking like a leaf. Yang nodded. "Yeah, I'm afraid." She took a breath. "But I'm still standing." Then Raven locked eyes with her. "You don't know all that I've gone through. I've stared death in the face over and over and spat, 'Oh, shut up.'" Yang cut her off. "Every time things get hard, you run. Every time things need doing, you get someone else to take the risks." She looked down at Vernal. "Did you get her killed too?" Raven's eyes blazed and she said, "How dare you? How dare you think I'm afraid?" Yang responded back, "You're afraid of Salem." Raven looked away and Yang stepped forward. "And if you think being a maiden paints a target on your back," she pointed toward the lamp, "imagine what having a relic would do." Yang continued, "Which is why I'm taking it. And when Salem comes," Yang's voice hardened, "I'll be there, waiting for her." Raven looked horrified, not because Yang was wrong, but because she was right. "Yang," her voice broke, "you don't want this." Yang nodded, "I know." Then she walked past her. "But I'm going to do it anyway." Raven stood frozen as she watched her daughter walk toward a fate she herself had spent years avoiding. Tears formed in her eyes. Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Yang never turned around. "Me too," she said. Then a portal opened behind her, and black feathers scattered through the air as Raven disappeared. Yang stared into the vault for a long time before she entered the pocket dimension and walked toward the floating lamp. Upstairs, Professor Lionheart burst into his office and frantically started opening drawers, searching, grabbing items, preparing to flee. Then a familiar voice spoke. "And where are you going?" Leo froze, the seer grim floating in the doorway. Salem's face watched from within. Lionheart swallowed. It was Cinder. She changed the plan." He whimpered. "The relic, the battle, but I can still help. I can evade the authorities. I can still be useful." Salem remained silent as the seer's tentacles drifted lazily. Then Leo Lionheart panicked and tried to activate his weapon. A tentacle instantly knocked it away. Panic consumed him. He tried to run. Then the seer struck. Tentacles wrapped around him, dragging him to the floor. "Please!" A strike. A barb pierced his back. Leo whispered, "Please!" A second barb stabbed into the back of his neck. Then silence. Salem watched for a while, then spoke a single word. Cowered back in the main hall, Mercury, Emerald, and the remaining villains found themselves surrounded. Ruby stepped forward. "It's over." Emerald shook with rage. "You don't understand. Cinder will come back, and when she does," the platform in front of them began to rise. Everyone turned and Yang emerged with the lamp in her hands. No cinder, no victory. Just the relic emerald's face went white, and something broke inside her. A massive illusion exploded into existence. The image of a towering woman nearly filled the hall. Everyone stared. Then the figure roared and vanished. Silence followed as Emerald Mercury, and Hazel used the confusion to escape. John swallowed. What was that? Oscar looked exhausted. An illusion, he said, and paused. But an accurate one. His voice dropped. That was Salem. No one spoke. A moment later, Yang handed the lamp to Crow. "What happened down there?" he asked. Yang hesitated, then lied. "I don't know. When I got there, Cinder was gone, and Vernal was dead. And Raven," Crow pushed. Yang looked away. "Gone?" Crow nodded slowly. "Well, it's good to have you back, Firecracker." Yang smiled faintly, then crossed the room. Ruby and Weiss sat together against a wall, exhausted, bruised, alive. Yang joined them, and a moment later Blake approached. She looked at all three. "What are you doing here?" Ruby laughed. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Blake smiled, then quietly said, "Well, I'm not going anywhere." The four girls looked at one another, then embraced. Team Ruby was finally back together again. Nearby, Oscar swayed, and Belgariad steadied him. Crow frowned. "You all right, kid?" Oscar nodded weakly, then spoke. "No, Ozpin has a message." Everyone turned. "We have to get the lamp," Oscar said, as his eyes began to close to Atlas. And then he collapsed. The relic had been won. The battle was over. But the journey ahead had only just begun. This is the end of Part 2 of this crossover event. Part 3 will see everyone traveling to Atlas, meeting new allies, and a showdown between Salem and General Ironwood and the mysterious trio who had unwittingly entered this world.